Hi and welcome. I'm Midnight Truth, and it's so nice to have you here tonight, wherever you are right now. Whether you're in bed, lying on the couch, or just looking for a quiet moment, I want you to know this time is for you. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, feel the weight of the day start to fade. Let your mind settle, let your body relax, and let yourself simply be. There's no rush, no pressure, just this calm, quiet moment. If you'd like, you can close your eyes and imagine yourself in a peaceful place. Maybe it's a cozy room with soft, warm lighting. Or maybe it's under a starry sky, with a gentle breeze brushing against you. Wherever you feel safe and calm, let yourself drift there. And if you're enjoying the moment, it would mean a lot if you could let me know where you're listening from, or simply tap the like button. It's a little thing, but it helps bring more people into this peaceful space. And if you feel like you'd like to hear more stories like this, go ahead and subscribe. No pressure, just if you feel it. Tonight's story is gentle and soothing, perfect to carry you into a deep, restful sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. Moving day always comes with a mix of emotions. For me, it was mostly exhaustion and a faint sense of hope. After the divorce, I needed a fresh start, and this old Victorian house tucked away on the outskirts of town seemed like the perfect place. It wasn't too big, not too small, and the rent was suspiciously cheap, a fact I chalked up to its age and the landlord's eagerness to have someone move in. I pulled up in my rusted sedan, staring at the faded blue shutters and the ivy climbing its way up the cracked stone walls. The house had character, that was for sure, but there was something else about it, too. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The way it stood slightly apart from the other homes, surrounded by gnarled trees that seemed too eager to reclaim the land, gave it an air of solitude. I spent most of the afternoon unloading boxes, my every step on the porch accompanied by the groan of aged wood. Inside, the floors creaked with every movement, the kind of sound that seemed to echo even when you stood still. I convinced myself it was charming, a testament to the house's history. The first few hours were spent organizing the essentials, plates, cutlery, bedding. By the time I collapsed onto the worn couch, I was too tired to do much more than stare at the high ceilings and the elaborate, albeit dusty, crown molding. "This'll do," I muttered to no one in particular. It was only then, in the stillness of the evening, that I started to notice the oddities. The air in the house felt heavier than it should, like stepping into a room just after someone had left. And there was a faint smell, something musky like old books or damp wood. Again, I shrugged it off. Old houses had smells. The first night was uneventful, save for the occasional groan of the pipes. I slept surprisingly well, despite the mattress feeling like it had been borrowed from a medieval dungeon. The next morning, I met Mrs. Carlson, my next-door neighbor. She was a spry woman in her 70s with a penchant for floral print dresses and an uncanny ability to appear out of nowhere. "Good morning," she chirped, startling me as I wrestled with a stubborn box in the trunk of my car. "You must be the new tenant." I nodded, wiping sweat from my brow. "That's me. Just moved in yesterday." Her smile faltered, just for a second, but enough for me to notice. "Well, welcome. It's a lovely house, isn't it?" "Yeah," I said, though my tone lacked conviction. "It's got charm." Mrs. Carlson's eyes darted toward the house, her expression unreadable. "You know, this place has quite a history. Been empty for a while now." "Oh, why's that?" She hesitated, as if weighing whether to say more. Finally, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "People say it's peculiar. The last tenant left in the middle of the night. Didn't even bother to pack. Claimed they heard things, footsteps, whispers. But you know how people are. Always looking for a story." I forced a laugh, though her words left a strange knot in my stomach. "Probably just the house settling," I offered. "Probably," she agreed, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Well, if you ever need anything, I'm just next door." As she walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was letting on. By the third day, I was starting to settle into a routine. Mornings were spent unpacking and organizing, afternoons wandering the small town, and evenings trying to make the house feel less empty. But no matter what I did, I couldn't ignore the little things. The way the floorboards creaked in the hallway at night, even when I was still. The faint tapping sound that seemed to come from the walls. The cold draft that slithered through the house, no matter how many windows I checked. One night, as I sat in the living room scrolling through my phone, I heard it, footsteps heavy and deliberate coming from upstairs. My heart stopped, and for a moment I sat frozen, straining to hear. The sound came again, this time closer, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the upstairs hallway. "Old house," I whispered to myself, gripping the edge of the couch. Just old pipes or the wind. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The next day, I decided to distract myself by tackling the attic. The narrow staircase leading up to it was steep, and the door at the top stuck as if it hadn't been opened in years. When I finally forced it open, I was greeted by a blast of cold air and the unmistakable scent of mildew. The attic was cluttered with forgotten belongings. Dusty trunks, broken furniture, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. As I sifted through the mess, I found an old journal tucked beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets. The leather cover was cracked, the pages brittle with age. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped it open. The handwriting was spidery and erratic. The ink faded but still legible. Asterisk March 12th, 1923. The rituals must be performed with precision. The door is opening, but the spirits are restless. I can feel their presence, watching, waiting. They whisper to me in the dark. Asterisk. A shiver ran down my spine as I read the words. The further I went, the more disturbing the entries became. Detailed accounts of rituals, strange symbols, and an obsession with contacting the other side. I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. It was just an old book, I told myself. Probably a piece of fiction, or the ramblings of someone with too much time on their hands. But as I descended the attic stairs, the weight in the air seemed heavier than before, pressing down on me like an invisible hand. That night, as I lay in bed, I swore I heard whispering, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. I buried my head under the pillow, my heart racing, and prayed for sleep to come quickly. It didn't. Sleep never came easily after that night. I'd always considered myself a rational person, but the whispers I'd heard in the dead of night were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I told myself it was exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. Moving was stressful, and I'd been pushing myself too hard. That had to be it, but the house had other plans. The next morning, I found myself drawn to the attic again. The journal I'd discovered the day before sat on the kitchen table where I'd left it. I didn't want to touch it. Something about the way the leather looked, cracked and worn, felt wrong, like it held more than words. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The passages I'd read were burned into my memory. The phrase "the door is opening" lingered the most. What door? And what kind of rituals had the writer been talking about? I had a million questions, but I also had no desire to dive deeper. I wasn't sure I wanted answers. By noon, I distracted myself by tackling the last of the unpacking. The sunlight streaming through the windows gave the house a warmth it didn't deserve. I kept the radio on as I worked, the music filling the silence. I told myself it was because I liked the noise, but really, it was to drown out the creaks and groans that seemed louder during the day. Around 3 p.m., I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find Mrs. Carlson standing on the porch, holding a plate of cookies wrapped in plastic. "I thought you might like a little treat," she said with a smile, though her eyes flitted nervously to the house behind me. "That's very kind of you," I said, taking the plate. "Would you like to come in?" Her face paled slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, no, dear. I just wanted to drop these off. I'm sure you're busy settling in." I didn't press her, though her reaction unsettled me. "Thanks again, Mrs. Carlson." Before she turned to leave, she hesitated. You know, if you ever feel uneasy, you're welcome to come by. Anytime, day or night. I frowned. Why would I feel uneasy? Her lips pressed into a thin line, as if she regretted saying anything. Oh, just, you know how old houses can be. Drafts, creaks, that sort of thing. Right, I said, trying to keep my tone light. I've noticed a few of those already. She didn't respond, only giving me a weak smile before shuffling back to her house. As I closed the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that her concern was deeper than she was letting on. That night, the house felt colder than usual. I checked the thermostat twice, but it was set to the same temperature as always. I wrapped myself in a blanket and settled on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV to distract myself. Then came the sound. It started as a soft thud, like something falling to the floor upstairs. I froze, the remote slipping from my hand. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time, a deliberate, rhythmic thud, followed by the unmistakable creak of footsteps. I grabbed my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I stood and moved toward the staircase, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stop. The sound continued, each step heavy and deliberate. It was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything at all, but the silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I considered running out of the house, but something kept me rooted in place. Curiosity? Fear? I wasn't sure. I climbed the stairs, my legs feeling like lead. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched out before me, bathed in the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the window at the far end. The door to my bedroom was ajar, though I was certain I'd closed it before coming downstairs. I stepped closer, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open wider. The room was empty. I exhaled sharply, relief flooding through me. I must have imagined it. That was the only explanation. But as I turned to leave, my gaze fell to the bed. The comforter was rumpled, the indentation of a body pressed into the mattress. My stomach turned, and I took a step back, my pulse roaring in my ears. Then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, fumbling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My breath came in short gasps as I pounded on the door. "Let me out!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The air in the room grew colder, and the faint scent of mildew filled my nostrils. And then I heard it, a whisper, soft and unintelligible, coming from the corner of the room. My eyes darted toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Nothing I could see, at least. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I clapped my hands over my ears, sinking to the floor. "Stop!" I cried. "Just stop!" And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise ceased. The door creaked open on its own, and I stumbled into the hallway, tears streaming down my face. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring up at the house. The windows seemed to watch me, dark and unblinking. My hands trembled as I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Mrs. Carlson's number. She answered on the second ring. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know what happened in this house." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "Come over," she said. "We need to talk." Mrs. Carlson lived in the small brick house just across the street. Her porch light cast a soft glow on the cracked sidewalk leading up to her door. I crossed the street quickly, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The house loomed behind me, its windows like dark eyes watching my every move. When I reached her door, she opened it before I even had the chance to knock. She must have been standing just inside, waiting. "Come in," she said, her voice low. She stepped aside, and I slipped past her into the warmth of her home. It smelled of cinnamon and wood polish, a stark contrast to the damp, musty odor that clung to my own house. She led me to the living room, where a teapot and 2 cups sat waiting on a small wooden table. I hadn't noticed her hands trembling until she poured the tea, spilling a few drops onto the saucer. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the floral-patterned sofa. Her demeanor was nervous, her eyes darting to the window as though she expected someone or something to be watching us. I sat, wrapping my hands around the warm teacup, though I had no intention of drinking. My stomach churned with unease. "I need you to tell me what's going on," I said, breaking the silence. "What happened in that house?" Mrs. Carlson sighed and settled into the armchair across from me. She seemed to age before my eyes, her shoulders sagging as though weighed down by some unseen burden. "That house," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's cursed. Everyone in this neighborhood knows it, though most of us don't talk about it. It's easier that way. Curse," I repeated, my voice tinged with disbelief. The word felt ridiculous coming out of my mouth, but after what I'd experienced, I wasn't in any position to dismiss it. She nodded. "It started with the man who built it, Elias Thorne." The name sent a shiver down my spine. "He was strange," she continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "This was back in the early 1900s. Thorne was a recluse, rarely seen outside, but people would talk. They'd say he was obsessed with the occult, always buying strange books and artifacts. Some claimed they saw him in the woods at night, drawing symbols in the dirt, chanting in languages no one understood." I swallowed hard, the warmth of the teacup doing little to ease the chill spreading through my body. "What happened to him?" I asked. "No one knows for sure," she said, her gaze distant. "One day he just disappeared. The house sat empty for years after that. People were too afraid to go near it, but eventually someone bought it, a young couple. They didn't last long." "What do you mean?" I pressed. Mrs. Carlson hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her chair. "They left in the middle of the night. The wife was hysterical, screaming about hearing voices and seeing shadows move on their own. The husband wouldn't talk about it. They just packed up and ran." "And the journal?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I found a journal in the attic. Did it belong to Thorne?" Her expression darkened. "I've heard rumors about that journal. People say it contains his rituals, his experiments. They say it's cursed, that anyone who reads it invites whatever's in that house to latch onto them." I felt the blood drain from my face. I'd read it. Not much, but enough. Enough for whatever it was to notice me. "I didn't believe the stories at first," Mrs. Carlson admitted, "but then I saw things. Shadows that shouldn't have been there. Doors slamming on their own. My husband." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, tears welling in her eyes. "What happened to your husband?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "He stayed in that house for one night," she said, her voice barely audible. "Just one night. He said he wanted to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. The next morning he was different. He wouldn't talk about what happened, but he started seeing things that weren't there, hearing things. He took his own life a few months later." I sat back, the weight of her words settling heavily on my chest. The house wasn't just haunted. It was dangerous, deadly. "I have to get out of there," I said, my voice trembling. Mrs. Carlson shook her head. "It's not that simple. Once the house has you, it doesn't let go." Her words sent a jolt of fear through me. "What do you mean?" "I mean it's not just the house," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's whatever he brought into it. It's tied to him, to that place, but it can follow you. It feeds on fear, on despair. Running won't stop it." I stared at her, my mind racing. I wanted to scream, to cry, to beg her to tell me she was wrong. But deep down, I knew she wasn't. The house had already sunk its claws into me. What do I do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Carlson hesitated, then reached into the drawer of the side table and pulled out a small, weathered book. This might help, she said, handing it to me. It's not much, but it's something. It's a guide to protection rituals, charms, things that might keep it at bay. I took the book with trembling hands, my mind a whirlwind of fear and doubt. Thank you, I said, though the words felt hollow. I wasn't sure anything could help me now. As I left her house and walked back to my own, the darkness seemed thicker, the air heavier. The house loomed ahead, its windows glinting in the moonlight like malevolent eyes. When I stepped inside, the silence was deafening. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, clutching the book to my chest. For the first time, I noticed a faint metallic smell in the air like blood. The floorboards creaked above me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I looked up at the ceiling, my breath catching in my throat. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed through the house, moving closer to the staircase. The footsteps echoed through the house, each step like a hammer pounding against my skull. I stood frozen in place, my hand gripping the book so tightly that my knuckles ached. The house seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter, the air colder. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so loudly, I thought it might explode. The steps grew louder, closer, and then they stopped. Complete silence. I stood in the entryway, my body rigid, eyes fixed on the staircase. I had to move. I had to do something, but my legs felt like lead, and all I could do was stand there, waiting. I could feel the cold air creeping down the hallway, seeping through the cracks in the walls. It wasn't just cold, it was unnatural, like the house itself was exhaling something ancient and malevolent. The footsteps started again, slow, deliberate, as though whoever or whatever was walking wanted me to hear it. Step, pause, step, pause, closer, closer. I finally snapped out of my trance, my feet moving on their own accord. I darted for the hallway, desperate to get to the kitchen, to find something, anything, that could give me a sense of control. The kitchen was dark, and the chill in the air was even worse. The fridge hummed, the only sound in the room besides my rapid breathing. I fumbled for the light switch, and when it flickered on, it cast long shadows across the walls. I scanned the room, my eyes wild. There was nothing but the normal mess of an old house, except the knife on the counter, the one I'd used to make dinner earlier. It was now angled at an odd tilt, as if someone had moved it, but I hadn't touched it since the night before. My pulse quickened. I knew that was the moment. I knew this wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. Whatever had been walking above me, whatever was in this house, was alive. It was real. It was aware of me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands and reach for the knife. It felt heavier than it should have, as though it had taken on some kind of presence, some sort of dark power. I didn't know what I was hoping for. I wasn't going to fight a ghost with a kitchen knife, but my mind was spiraling. I needed to be armed. I needed to feel like I had some control over the situation. Suddenly, I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible, like a whisper, a voice. Or was it? I froze, holding the knife tightly in my hand. It wasn't my imagination. Someone, or something, was whispering from upstairs. I slowly crept back toward the stairs, my breath shallow. The whispering grew louder. It sounded like words I couldn't quite understand. They were soft and rhythmic, almost like a chant. I reached the base of the stairs and, against every instinct screaming in my head, I started to climb. Step by step, I ascended, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The air grew colder with each step, the temperature dropping so suddenly that my breath came out in visible clouds. When I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated. I could hear it now, definite whispering, but no one was there. It wasn't a person. It was something else. My eyes flicked around the hallway. The floorboards creaked again, louder this time, as though something heavy had shifted just out of sight. I nearly dropped the knife. I stepped into the first room on the right, my bedroom. The door creaked open, and the light from the hallway spilled in. My heart skipped a beat. There, sitting on the edge of the bed, was a figure, a shadow, a silhouette of a person, but there was no definition to it, just a mass of dark, swirling energy. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as if the air had thickened, become suffocating. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, watching me, waiting. I forced myself to speak, but my voice trembled. "Who are you?" The shadow didn't respond, but I could feel its gaze on me. It was as if it was trying to reach inside me, to see through my soul. Then it moved. Slowly it stood, and the room seemed to grow even colder, as if the very temperature of the air had dropped below freezing. The shadow shifted toward me, its form stretching like smoke, creeping toward me in a way that made every instinct in my body scream to run. But I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. The cold wrapped around me, locking me in place. The whispering came again, louder this time, but now it wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice, a deep, guttural voice that filled the room. "I was waiting for you." It wasn't a sentence. It was more like a command. The voice felt ancient, and its power filled the room, pressing down on me, suffocating me. The temperature continued to drop, and my breath formed icy mist in the air. I could hear the footsteps again, closer this time. They were not the soft, slow steps I had heard earlier. These were heavy, deliberate, echoing through the house. The figure didn't move, but it was right in front of me now. The whispering, the cold, the feeling of something suffocatingly close. It was too much. I couldn't take it anymore. I backed away, suddenly able to move, stumbling toward the door. My hand reached for the handle, but the door wouldn't open. The cold was too much. I could feel something pressing against my back, as if it was holding me there, keeping me from leaving. "Leave!" The voice rasped louder now, like nails scraping across metal. "Leave before it's too late." I didn't hesitate any longer. I threw my shoulder into the door, and it flew open. I bolted down the stairs, the sound of the footsteps behind me following, growing louder, echoing down the hall. I didn't look back. I ran straight out the front door into the cold night air, not caring that I had left everything behind. The house loomed in the distance, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I had to get out. As I sprinted down the street, I heard it, footsteps following me, slow, deliberate. Step, pause, step. They were still with me, and I knew, deep in my gut, that the house hadn't let me go. It was waiting for the next person to move in. The darkness outside felt like a temporary escape, but even as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The footsteps behind me had stopped when I reached the end of the street, but the dread still clung to me like a heavy cloak. The night air was crisp, but my skin felt unnaturally cold, as if the chill from the house had followed me. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get as far from that place as possible. My mind raced, replaying every moment in the house. The whispers, the shadow, the pressure that seemed to fill every room with a suffocating darkness. I was shaken, but not just from fear. I was confused, disoriented. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Was it real? Had I imagined it all? No. I knew it wasn't just my mind. I wasn't crazy. The house had done something to me, and whatever had been there wasn't finished with me. I found myself standing on a street corner, not sure when I had wandered so far from the house. My heart still pounded, but it had slowed down enough for my rational mind to start working again. I needed answers. I couldn't just leave and pretend it hadn't happened. I had to go back. I didn't know why I thought that, but something inside me, The same pull that had dragged me into that house in the first place urged me to return. If I didn't, I would never feel free again. The thought of leaving and letting that thing have the house to itself was too much. No! I needed to finish this. I turned around, walking slowly back down the road. The streetlights flickered overhead, their dull glow casting long shadows. The cold had seeped into my bones, and my mind was a storm of confusion and dread. My thoughts kept drifting back to the book I'd found, the journal of the house's original owner. I needed to know more. If I could understand what had happened, maybe I could stop it. When I arrived back at the house, it loomed in the distance, just as foreboding as before. The porch light was still on, though the rest of the house remained in complete darkness. I stood there, staring at it, my heart racing again. It was as if the house was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and approached the front door. The key was still in my pocket from when I had hurriedly left earlier. I hesitated for a moment, then shoved the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, the same eerie sound as before. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. It felt colder than before, but I pushed the chill aside and focused on the task at hand. I needed the journal, the book that held the secrets to everything. I made my way to the study, the room where I'd found it earlier. The floorboards creaked with every step, each noise unnaturally loud in the stillness of the house. The air felt thick, heavy. I could almost feel the house breathing, exhaling around me, its presence so strong that it seemed to weigh on me physically. When I reached the study, I stepped inside cautiously, as though expecting something or someone to be waiting for me. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the windows. I found the book exactly where I had left it, the thick leather cover worn and cracked. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed it, and as soon as my fingers brushed the surface, I felt a surge of energy run through me, cold and electrifying. I opened the journal, flipping through the yellowed pages. The handwriting was shaky at times, and some of the words were smeared as if the author had written in a frenzy. As I read, I began to piece together the history of the house, the tragic tale of its original owner, who had been obsessed with the occult. Her name was Lydia, a woman who had moved into this house years ago, drawn to it by its mysterious allure. According to the journal, she had been a scholar of ancient rituals, seeking forbidden knowledge. She had been determined to open a gateway to the other side, to summon something from beyond. The more I read, the more it became clear that Lydia had succeeded, but at a great cost. She had summoned something that she couldn't control, something that had taken hold of the house and refused to let go. The last entry in the journal was unsettling. It was a warning, written in bold, frantic letters. Asterisk, it's not just a house. It's me. I can't escape it. I am bound to this place. The door is open. It's too late. You can't run. It's already inside you. Asterisk. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding again. The cold had returned in full force, and the air around me felt thick, suffocating. Then, the whispering started. At first, it was just a soft murmur, something I could almost dismiss. But as I listened, the words became clearer. Leave. It was a voice, deep and hollow, echoing through the room. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, more alive. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor, as if something was holding me in place. I turned to the door, but it slammed shut on its own. I ran to the window, but the glass wouldn't budge. The room was closing in on me, the temperature dropping so low that my breath was visible in front of me. The shadows in the corners seemed to twist and writhe, as if something was coming for me, something just out of sight. The whispering grew louder, louder still, until it was a deafening roar in my ears. Asterisk, it's too late. You're already here. Asterisk. I couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing thick with cold, and the whispers turned into screams. I could hear them all around me now, voices shouting, calling my name. Suddenly, something grabbed my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around to face the empty room. The shadow moved again, stretching, distorting, as if it were trying to take form. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran toward the door again, throwing myself against it, and this time it opened. I stumbled out of the room, out of the study, and down the stairs as quickly as I could. The footsteps followed me, louder, closer, but I didn't dare look back. I burst through the front door and ran into the night once again. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town, gasping for breath, my chest tight. I couldn't go back. I wouldn't, but deep down I knew the truth. The house hadn't let go of me, and whatever had been waiting inside it was still out there, waiting for the next person to step inside. The days that followed felt like I was walking through a fog, a haze of confusion and fear. I couldn't sleep without hearing the whispers echoing in my head. Even in the daylight, the darkness of the house seemed to follow me, clinging to my thoughts, infecting everything I did, every corner I turned, every unfamiliar face I saw. It was as if the house's presence had stretched far beyond its crumbling walls. I told myself I was being irrational. I had left, hadn't I? I'd escaped. But the truth was, I was scared of what I had learned, and even more terrified of what I hadn't yet uncovered. There was still so much about that house and Lydia, and whatever curse she had unleashed, that I didn't understand. And if I was being honest with myself, part of me felt drawn back to it, like a magnet, pulling me towards something I couldn't comprehend. I tried to keep my mind occupied. I threw myself into work, forcing myself to stay busy. But when the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew long, that familiar feeling of unease crept back. I couldn't shake it. The house was still there, its cold fingers wrapped tightly around my thoughts. It was late one evening when I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed answers. I had to go back. But this time, I wasn't just going to rush in blindly. I needed more than just a journal. I needed to find out what had really happened in that house, what had happened to Lydia, and why her presence seemed to linger like a dark cloud over everything I did. I grabbed my keys and headed out. The drive was short, but it felt endless, each minute dragging on as my anxieties swelled in my chest. My mind kept racing, thinking about the journal's cryptic warning. Asterisk, it's too late. You're already here. Asterisk, what did that mean? How was I already involved? When I reached the house, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The air felt still, stagnant. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence. I parked in front of the house and sat there for a moment, staring at it. It looked just as I remembered, old, weathered, but somehow more menacing in the dark. I grabbed the journal, my hands trembling as I stepped out of the car. The door creaked open before I even touched it, and I hesitated for a moment. The house seemed to welcome me back, as if it had been waiting. I stepped inside, the familiar smell of dust and decay hitting me instantly. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't place. It wasn't just the age of the house, it felt wrong. I could almost hear the house breathing, its wooden beams groaning under the weight of its history. I made my way upstairs, feeling every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. The shadows seemed deeper now, more oppressive. I reached the study again, the place where I found the journal, and pushed open the door. It was as if nothing had changed. The book was still on the desk, untouched. But as I reached for it, I felt something else, a presence. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The room felt colder, the air heavier, like I wasn't alone. I glanced around, but there was nothing but the thick, suffocating silence. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Then, from the corner of the room, I saw it, a shadow. It was faint, but unmistakable. It seemed to shift, moving just out of the corner of my eye. I snapped my head toward it, but it was gone. My breath caught in my throat, and I forced myself to take a step forward. I couldn't let fear control me, not now. The journal was just a few feet away. I reached out, my hand brushing the leather cover once again. It was cold, like touching ice. As I opened the journal to continue reading, I noticed something strange. The words I had read before were still there, but they had changed. The ink was smudged in places, as if the pages had been touched recently. I ran my fingers over the page, but when I looked down, the words had shifted. They were different, more urgent, more frantic. Asterisk, it's watching you. It's not finished. It's inside you now. Asterisk, I recoiled, dropping the book as a sudden rush of cold air swept through the room. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The whispers started again, softer at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Asterisk, you should never have come back. Asterisk, the voice came from behind me, low and guttural, and I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. But there was nothing there. The room was empty. The shadows danced along the walls, stretching and writhing like living things. The whispers continued, but now they were joined by something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps coming from the hallway outside. I had to leave. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing with panic. I backed toward the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. My breath hitched, and the room seemed to shrink around me. The shadows were closing in, swallowing the space whole. Asterisk, leave now. It's too late for you. Asterisk, the voice was closer now, right behind me. I spun around, my eyes wide with fear, but once again, there was nothing there. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I felt the cold, biting air press against my skin. Suddenly, something cold touched my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around to face the empty room, but there was nothing. The room was silent again, too silent. The tapping stopped, the whispers ceased, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe I had just lost my mind. But as I reached for the door again, I felt a hand, icy cold, grip my wrist. I looked down at the hand, pale and thin, almost skeletal. It wasn't my own. A voice, no longer a whisper but a scream, echoed in my mind. Asterisk, you can't escape. Asterisk, the door burst open with a violent crash, and I was pulled into the hallway. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest as the shadows followed, stretching out toward me, crawling along the walls. The house was alive, and it wasn't letting me go. I ran, not looking back, the pounding footsteps chasing me, relentless and suffocating. Every step I took felt heavier, harder, like the house was trying to drag me back. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick and suffocating, until I burst out the front door into the night air, gasping for breath. I didn't look back as I ran. I couldn't, and even though I managed to escape once again, I knew that the house wasn't done with me. It was waiting for the next time I thought I could walk away. And I could feel it deep inside me. A part of it was already there, lurking just beneath the surface. I didn't go back to the house. Not immediately. For days, I stayed in my apartment, keeping the curtains drawn and the doors locked. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about the touch I'd felt, the whispers, the presence that seemed to follow me. I thought I was going crazy, but then the nightmares began. They were vivid, more real than anything I'd ever dreamed before. I would wake up, gasping for breath, my heart racing, and I'd swear I could still feel the cold fingers gripping my wrist. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was stressed, that the house had gotten inside my head. But deep down, I knew something far worse was happening. The house hadn't let me go. I could feel it, like an echo in the back of my mind, pulling me back, whispering to me in the dark. It had been a week since I left, and I hadn't told anyone about what happened. How could I? Who would believe me? My life had always been ordinary. No strange experiences, no brushes with the supernatural. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had latched onto me. One evening, while I was sitting in my living room, I heard a knock on the door. My pulse shot up. It was late, well past 10, and no one ever visited me at this hour. I stood frozen, listening intently. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Are you there?" I didn't recognize it, but there was something about the tone, the urgency, that sent a chill down my spine. I slowly approached the door, my hand hovering over the knob. I debated whether I should open it, whether it was a mistake. But I didn't have to decide. The door swung open by itself, creaking on its hinges. I gasped, stepping back in surprise. The hallway outside was empty, but I knew I wasn't alone. Then, the voice came again, clearer this time. "Help me." I whipped around, scanning the room. Nothing. The silence in my apartment felt suffocating. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking, barely above a whisper. But no one answered. I turned back to the door, the sudden urge to step outside overwhelming me. I was drawn to the hallway, to whatever was calling me. My heart was pounding, and my legs felt heavy as I stepped into the corridor. It was cold, colder than usual, a chill in the air that made my breath visible, like winter had descended in the span of a few seconds. I moved down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the empty apartment. The silence pressed down on me, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. As I reached the staircase, I paused. There was a flicker of movement, too fast for me to catch, but I saw it nonetheless. The shadow of something that wasn't human. It vanished at the top of the stairs, just out of sight. I didn't think, I just moved. My body reacted before my mind could stop it. My legs carried me up the stairs in a frantic rush. The air grew colder with each step I took, the temperature dropping so rapidly I could see the vapor of my breath in front of me. When I reached the top of the stairs, I felt it again, a presence hovering just behind me. The shadows seemed to shift, curling around the walls like they were alive. I froze, heart hammering. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, echoing in the otherwise silent house. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted out of the apartment, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, frozen by the fear that gripped my chest. I felt the cold breath against the back of my neck, a whisper against my ear. "Get out, it's coming." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Then, something slammed into my back, knocking me to the floor. I scrambled, trying to push myself up, but the weight was too much. It felt like someone or something was sitting on top of me, pressing me into the floor, their cold hands wrapping around my arms, holding me down. "Get out!" The voice hissed again, this time directly in my ear. The room spun, my vision blurred with panic. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold wooden floor, desperately trying to push myself free. The weight lifted suddenly, and I gasped for air. I scrambled to my feet, the room spinning around me. But when I looked up, the hallway was empty. No one was there. The silence returned, heavier than before. I didn't wait to question what had just happened. I ran, stumbling down the stairs and out the door, never looking back. I could still feel the coldness, the weight on my chest, like something had followed me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment, my eyes darting from corner to corner, expecting something to emerge from the shadows. The house had come with me, and I was starting to realize that no matter where I went, it wouldn't let me escape. I had to know more about what I had walked into. The journal wasn't enough. The whispers, the visions, the touch. It all pointed to something far more dangerous than I had anticipated. Whatever Lydia had started, it hadn't ended with her. And if I didn't stop it, it would consume me, too. But how could I stop something that had already gotten inside? How could I fight something that had already claimed me? I was no longer sure if I was running away from the house or running towards something far worse. I spent the next few days in a daze, replaying every moment in my head over and over. The touch on my back, the cold breath on my neck, the voice whispering in my ear. It didn't feel real, yet it did. There was no logical explanation for it. No way to explain how I'd been thrown to the floor, how I had felt that presence suffocating me. I couldn't escape it. I knew I needed answers. So, despite the fear gnawing at me, I decided to return to the house. This time, I wasn't going to run. This time, I was going to face it. I didn't sleep much that night. The hours seemed to stretch, and the shadows in my apartment felt too thick, too alive. When dawn finally broke, I stood by the window, staring out at the gray morning. The house was still there, looming in the distance. It felt like a dark cloud had settled over it, heavy and oppressive. I drove there in the early morning, hoping the quiet would give me the courage I lacked. The closer I got to the house, the heavier the air seemed to become. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, watching me, but I pressed on. When I stepped through the front door again, it was just as I remembered. Creaky floorboards, a musty smell in the air, an unsettling silence that seemed to stretch through the house. But now, I wasn't just seeing the house, I was feeling it. Every crack in the walls, every odd noise seemed amplified, like the house itself was alive, breathing. I made my way through the halls, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. There was something different this time, something more intense. I could almost hear whispers, too faint to understand, but enough to make my skin crawl. I headed to the basement, the place I had avoided the first time, the place that felt like the heart of the house. I had to know what had happened here. The stairs creaked beneath my weight as I descended, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The basement smelled like damp earth, old wood, and something else, something faintly metallic. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the room. There on the far wall was something I hadn't noticed before. A large, faded symbol, drawn hastily in what looked like chalk or some other substance. It was a circle, with strange lines and markings that seemed to twist and writhe on the wall. Even in the dim light, I stepped closer, my heart racing. I ran my fingers over the symbols, feeling the coldness of the wall beneath. It was almost as if the drawing had been left here for a reason, like a warning. And then I saw it, a small, leather-bound journal resting on the ground beside the symbol. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and flipped through the pages. The handwriting was shaky, frantic, and it became clear that whoever had written this had been in the grip of something far beyond human understanding. The journal belonged to the original owner, Lydia. She had been obsessed with the occult, just as I had suspected. The entries were filled with rituals, spells, and prayers to dark, forgotten gods. She had performed these rituals in the house, and each one seemed to grow darker, more desperate. There were notes about opening doors to other worlds, other realms, and summoning things that should never be summoned. But it wasn't until I reached the final entry that I understood. Asterisk, I have opened the door. It is here, with me. It whispers in the night, and I hear its footsteps on the stairs. I thought I could control it, but now I know I cannot. It has marked me, and it will never let me go. If anyone reads this, know that you are already too late. It will come for you, just as it came for me. Asterisk, my blood ran cold as I finished reading. Lydia hadn't been insane. She hadn't been hallucinating. She had summoned something that had been in the house for decades. And now, it was following me. I slammed the journal shut and backed away from the wall. My mind was racing. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. But as I turned to head for the stairs, I froze. The air in the basement had shifted. It was colder, even more oppressive than before. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just ran. My heart was pounding in my chest as I bolted up the stairs, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The footsteps were growing louder, closer. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped. The front door was wide open. The wind howled outside, making the house groan and creak. But there was something else. A shape standing in the doorway. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, too thin. A shadow, darker than the night itself, standing still, waiting. I took a step back, and then another. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the house. I turned and ran, not looking back. My breath was ragged, my vision blurred with panic. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, the weight of the house pressing down on me like 1,000 tons. I couldn't go back. I couldn't stay. But even as I stood there in the yard, feeling the cold wind against my skin, I knew it wasn't over. The house had already marked me, and whatever had followed Lydia was now following me. It had already claimed her, and I was next. The fear settled deep in my bones, a gnawing, endless feeling that no matter where I went, it would find me. I couldn't escape it. Not now. Not ever. And the worst part, I knew it wasn't finished. It wasn't done with me yet. The footsteps would never stop. It's funny how your mind tries to make sense of the impossible. After I left the house, I thought I could shake it off. I told myself it was just my nerves, just an overactive imagination. After all, I'd been through a lot recently. Moving into a new town, adjusting to life after the divorce, it had all been overwhelming. Maybe that was why I'd felt those things. Maybe the darkness had simply crept in because I was already so vulnerable. But the nightmares didn't stop. The footsteps, the whispers. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow standing in the doorway, waiting for me. I could feel it, watching me even when I was awake, its presence lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. And the sounds. The sounds never stopped. At first, it was just an occasional creak of the floorboards in my apartment, a soft tap on the walls at night. But then it became something more. I could hear footsteps moving around my apartment when I was alone, and the kitchen door would open by itself in the middle of the night. I tried to ignore it, but the cold breath that occasionally grazed my neck told me I wasn't imagining it. The touch on my skin, like invisible fingers trailing across my arm, icy and unsettling, was real. It felt like the house had followed me, like it was inside me, in my head, in my bones. I didn't know where to go for help. I couldn't tell anyone the truth. Who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy. So, I started doing what I thought would make it stop. I researched everything I could find about hauntings, about curses, about anything that might explain what was happening to me. But nothing worked. The more I read, the more I realized that what I was experiencing wasn't just a haunting. It was something darker. I returned to the library, desperate for answers. I combed through old books and local records, anything that might shed light on the house's history. That's when I found it, a faded article buried at the back of a dusty folder. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearance. Local woman vanishes after moving into old house." The article was about Lydia, the original owner of the house. It detailed how one cold autumn evening, she had simply vanished without a trace. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of foul play. The police had investigated, but there was nothing, except one thing. The neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house in the days leading up to her disappearance. Heavy footsteps, loud bangs, and what sounded like chanting at odd hours of the night. Some had even claimed to see shadowy figures moving around the windows, though no one could prove anything. The article mentioned that Lydia's family had tried to sell the house after her disappearance, but it had sat empty for years. No one had dared live there for long. And eventually, the house was sold to another young woman who disappeared under similarly mysterious circumstances. The same pattern, the same signs, The same thing that had happened to Lydia was now happening to me. I didn't want to believe it, but everything I had experienced, the whispers, the cold touch, the footsteps, fit the pattern perfectly. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. I had to go back. I knew it was dangerous. I knew that whatever was in that house didn't want anyone to leave. But I had to face it. I had to stop it, or it would never stop coming after me. The drive back to the house felt different this time. It wasn't just fear. I felt like something was pulling me toward it, like I had no choice. As if the house had a claim on me now, and there was no escaping it. When I arrived, the house stood as it always had, silent, waiting. The wind rustled the dead leaves around the yard, and the trees groaned in the breeze. The door was slightly ajar, as if it had been expecting me. I stepped inside. The air was thick, heavier than it had ever been. It pressed down on me, suffocating. I could feel the presence before I even saw it. The temperature dropped, and the familiar smell of must and decay filled the air. The house seemed different now. It wasn't just old, it was alive. I made my way to the basement again. The dark symbols on the wall were still there, still glowing faintly in the dim light. The journal was waiting for me, as if it knew I would return. I took the journal, but this time, instead of flipping through it in a panic, I took my time. I read the entries carefully. There were more details about Lydia's rituals, about how she had made a pact with something far older than the house itself. She had sought power, control, but instead, she had opened a door that should have stayed closed. The more I read, the more I understood. The thing that haunted this house wasn't a ghost. It wasn't even a demon. It was something older, something that had existed long before this house was built. It was a creature, an entity, bound to the land itself. And Lydia's mistake had freed it, but there was a way to stop it. The journal described a ritual, an exorcism of sorts, that could close the door Lydia had opened. It was dangerous, but it was the only chance I had left. If I didn't perform it, if I didn't finish what Lydia had started, the entity would keep claiming more victims. But even as I read the words, I knew it wasn't as simple as following the ritual. There was something about it that made my blood run cold. The ritual didn't just involve the house. It involved me, my life, my soul, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to make that choice. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, steady and slow. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. It was there, the shadow, the thing that had been following me since the first night. It stood at the top of the stairs, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed the journal, clutching it to my chest. I was going to perform the ritual, but as I reached the door, I heard the whisper again, closer this time, right in my ear. Asterisk, you can't escape. Asterisk, and I knew deep down that it was true. No one ever leaves this house. Not complete. I don't know how I managed to get out of the house that night. Maybe it was sheer panic. Maybe it was instinct. But I ran. I ran as fast as I could, my legs shaking with every step, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The shadow, whatever it was, followed me. I could feel it, like a cold weight on my back, pressing down on me, keeping me from escaping. The further I got away from the house, the stronger the presence became, until I could almost hear its footsteps in rhythm with mine. It was as if the house had become a part of me, woven into my soul, and it wouldn't let go. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, but somehow I managed to start the engine. I slammed the door shut and locked it, as if that would keep whatever it was from getting to me. The road ahead was dark and empty. I could barely see anything through the windshield. My eyes bleary from lack of sleep and the constant dread that had settled in my chest. But I didn't dare look back, not even once. I drove for what felt like hours, but the unease didn't go away. I kept thinking I saw figures in the rearview mirror, shadows, shapes that didn't belong, but when I turned around, there was nothing, just the empty road, stretching out into the darkness. Finally, I reached a motel. one that looked worn and forgotten, like it had been abandoned by time itself. I parked and checked in, my body moving on autopilot. I didn't want to stay anywhere, but I had nowhere else to go, and I knew that if I stopped for even a moment, the fear would swallow me whole. I thought I could sleep. I thought I could rest. But even as I lay in that dingy bed, the sound of footsteps, the same heavy footsteps that had followed me from the house, echoed in my mind. The whispers returned too, curling around my thoughts like cold smoke. The thing was still with me. I could feel it. It had been with me all along. The fear twisted inside me, eating away at the edges of my sanity. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I couldn't make a sound, couldn't move. I felt paralyzed, trapped in my own body. I don't know how long I lay there, listening to the distant murmur of voices outside my window, but eventually, I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, it was morning, but the fear hadn't left. It still clung to me, thick and suffocating, like a shadow that I couldn't shake off. I left the motel early, hoping that getting away from the town would give me some peace. I thought maybe if I went far enough, the house wouldn't follow me. But deep down, I knew it was a lie. The house wasn't just a place. It was an idea, a curse that had latched onto me, and no matter how far I ran, it would always be there. I tried to go back to my old life, tried to force myself to forget, but it didn't work. I couldn't forget the house, the rituals, the entity that had claimed Lydia and all the others. Days passed, then weeks. I kept myself busy, distracted, trying to ignore the shadows that lingered just outside the edges of my vision. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, felt it, the cold breath on my neck, the pressure on my chest, the footsteps following me through the halls. And then one night, just as I was about to go to bed, I received an email. It was from a stranger, someone I didn't know. The subject line read, "Asterisk, it's not over. Asterisk." I opened it without thinking. The message was short, but it made my blood run cold. Asterisk, you left, but the house will always find you. It has found me, and it will find you too. We are connected. Don't think you're free. The door is still open, and it's waiting for you. Be careful. Asterisk, there was no name, no signature, just that chilling message. I wanted to ignore it, to delete it and pretend it was just a prank, but I couldn't. I knew what it meant. The entity hadn't let go of me. It was still out there, and it was still watching. I thought about going to the police, about telling them everything, but then I realized they wouldn't believe me. They would never believe what had happened. No one would. I thought back to the last time I was in the house. The feeling of the door closing behind me, the whispers in my ear. I had escaped, yes, but I didn't feel free. Not anymore. The thing that haunted the house hadn't just been trapped in that place. It was everywhere now. It was in the air I breathed, in the shadows that followed me, in the whispers that never stopped. And as the days passed, I began to realize the truth. The house wasn't done with me. It was waiting. I had run, yes, but it would always find me. I could feel it, as sure as I could feel my own heartbeat. No one ever truly leaves the house. Not completely. It waits. And when it calls, you answer, even if you don't want to. It wasn't just the house that haunted me now. It was a sensation that it was everywhere I went. A presence that lurked just beyond my vision, in the corner of every room, in every crack and crevice, in the air itself. I'd wake up in the middle of the night breathless, feeling the cold presence pressing in on me, like I wasn't alone. I tried to tell myself that I was just paranoid, that I was overreacting. The house was behind me, and I'd left it, gone far away. I told myself I was safe now, but deep down, I knew the truth. It had followed me. The curse had followed me, and no matter where I went, it would never stop. I tried to distract myself. I filled my days with work, my nights with friends, anything to avoid being alone with my thoughts. But it was no use. The whispers came back, slowly at first, like a murmur beneath my thoughts. They were faint, distant, but unmistakable. And then one evening, I got a call. I didn't recognize the number, but something in my gut told me I had to answer it. Hello. My voice was shaky, betraying the nerves I'd been trying to hide for weeks. Is this Sarah? The voice on the other end was raspy, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. Yes, who's this? It's Lydia. I need to talk to you. My heart skipped a beat. Lydia, the woman who had lived in the house before me, the one who had left in such a hurry, babbling about curses and demons. I hadn't heard from her since the day I moved in. What do you mean, Lydia? I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Where are you? I'm not safe, she whispered. You have to listen to me. You have to understand what I did, what I started. Her voice trembled, the words hanging in the air like they didn't quite belong. Lydia, what happened? What's going on? She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice so low I could barely hear it, she said, the house is still open. It's not over. It wants us. The line went dead. I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone in disbelief. Was this a joke? Or had Lydia really been calling to warn me? I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't just brush it off. I needed to know what she meant. I had to find her. The next morning, I drove to her old apartment. It was a small, run-down place on the edge of town. The building was silent, the windows dark. It looked abandoned, just like the house. I knocked on her door, but there was no answer. I waited, my hand resting on the doorknob, before I decided to try it. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The apartment was eerily still. The air was thick with dust, the faint smell of mildew lingering in the corners. I walked through the living room, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. There was a stack of boxes in the corner, piled high, as if she had been in the middle of packing when something stopped her. A sudden movement caught my eye, something in the shadows. I turned, but there was nothing there, just a shadow, stretching across the wall like it was alive. I shivered. I couldn't stay here. It felt wrong, but I needed answers. I needed to understand what Lydia had meant. I moved to the back of the apartment, where a small bedroom awaited me. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing a room that looked just as abandoned as the rest of the place. But then I saw it. On the bed, a book lay open. It was a journal, Lydia's journal. I realized. I moved closer, my heart pounding. I flipped it open to the first page, my eyes scanning the words that seemed to drip with fear. Asterisk, the house calls to me in the night. I hear it, the whispers, the footsteps. I can't sleep. I can't think. I feel like I'm losing myself. Asterisk, the next few pages were filled with frantic scribbles, descriptions of strange rituals, of doors that shouldn't have been opened, of things that shouldn't have been awakened. But it was the last page that sent a chill through me. It was dated just a few days before Lydia had disappeared. Asterisk, I made a mistake. I opened the door. It's here. It's inside me. It won't let go. It wants to take me, to take us all. I don't know how to stop it. I don't know how to make it stop. I'm so sorry. Asterisk, the words blurred in front of my eyes, my hands shaking as I read them. I couldn't breathe. I felt like the walls were closing in around me. I heard it then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, the sound of someone or something walking in the apartment with me. I turned around, but there was no one there. Just the empty room, the open window, and the eerie silence. But I could still feel it. The presence. It was there, lurking just beyond my sight, watching me. I backed away, my eyes scanning every corner of the room, but I couldn't escape the feeling that it was closing in. And then I saw it. A shadow moved across the wall, stretching and twisting, like it was alive. I froze, unable to move. It was coming for me. I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran out of that apartment, out of that building, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I stumbled out onto the street, I knew the truth. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The house had followed me. It was still with me, and it wasn't going to let go. I couldn't escape it. The thing that haunted me had become a part of me, like a shadow cast over my every move, my every breath. No matter where I went, I felt it, lurking just beyond the corners of my vision. I tried to push it away, tried to live my life as if the past didn't matter. But the past had a way of catching up with you, of making you pay for every mistake, every choice you thought was long behind you. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. It was like being tied to the house with invisible threads, each tugging me back, dragging me towards something I couldn't see, something I didn't want to understand. And the whispers, oh God, the whispers, they came in the dead of night, soft and insistent, like the wind creeping through the cracks of a forgotten building. I couldn't sleep anymore. Not really. When I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow that had followed me from the house. It was never far behind. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, sent my heart racing. I heard footsteps in the hall and the stairwell, in the empty rooms of my apartment. I would wake, drenched in sweat, convinced that something was standing over me, waiting for me to open my eyes. I didn't know who to turn to. Everyone I spoke to thought I was crazy. I had no proof, nothing tangible to show them, just a nagging, suffocating feeling that something was wrong, something that had followed me, not just physically, but in my mind. One night, after another sleepless, restless evening, I decided to go back to the house. It felt like a horrible, inevitable choice, but I couldn't keep running. I had to face it. I drove out there, the familiar road twisting in front of me, dark and desolate. My headlights sliced through the night, illuminating the twisted trees and empty fields. As I approached the house, my stomach twisted into knots. The house stood there like a monument to something dark, something ancient, waiting for me to return. I parked in front of it, the engine ticking as it cooled. The house loomed in the distance, silent and still. But I knew better than to believe it was quiet. I knew it was watching me, just like it had watched every person who had come before me. I stepped out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was colder than it had been in weeks, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, the pressure building in my ears. The windows of the house were dark, the curtains drawn tight. But even from here, I could feel it, the oppressive presence that seemed to seep from the walls, the very foundation of the place. I walked up to the front door, each step feeling like it took me deeper into the earth, deeper into the house's grasp. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, but it turned easily, as if it had been waiting for me all this time. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under my weight. The house was just as I remembered it, decaying, forgotten, but still alive in its own way. The smell of mildew and rotting wood filled my nostrils. The darkness pressed in on me, the silence broken only by the sound of my breath and the creaking floorboards beneath my feet. I hesitated for a moment, standing in the foyer, unsure of where to go. But then I knew. I had to go upstairs. I had to go to the attic, to the place where it all began. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like it took me further into the past, into the history of the house. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and narrow. The air felt colder here, like it had been trapped for years. The shadows seemed to move, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I moved toward the attic door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The door opened with a groan, revealing a small, cluttered space filled with old furniture, boxes, and dust. The attic was dim, the only light coming from a small, cracked window at the far end. And there in the corner was something that shouldn't have been there. A book, an old, leather-bound book that looked as if it had been sitting untouched for years. I couldn't stop myself. I walked over to it, my fingers brushing the cover as if it were calling to me. It was the same book Lydia had written in, the same journal that had warned me of the curse. I opened it. The pages stiff and yellowed with age. The handwriting was familiar, but twisted, frantic. It was Lydia's writing, but something had changed. It was more desperate now, more broken. Asterisk, it's too late. It's too late for all of us. The door is open and it won't close. We were foolish to think we could control it. It has taken everything. It's inside me now. Inside all of us. We can't escape. We can't go back. The house won't let us go. Asterisk. The word sent a chill through me. I could feel my pulse quicken as I read, my mind racing. The house had never been just a building. It was something else, something ancient, something that couldn't be stopped. I turned the page, my hands shaking, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Asterisk, I hear it now. The footsteps. It's waiting. It will always be waiting. And when the time comes, it will take us one by one. The house will claim us all. And then, asterisk. The page ended there abruptly, as if Lydia had been interrupted. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Suddenly, the room went cold. I turned, and there it was, standing in the doorway. The shadow. It was the same one I had seen all those nights ago. The one that had followed me from the house, from Lydia. It was here, in the attic. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was too much, too overwhelming. The shadow moved closer, its form flickering in the dim light, stretching and twisting like it was made of smoke. It reached out its cold, clammy hand brushing against my face. And then everything went dark. Story 2. The house was quiet when I first walked in, the kind of quiet that wraps itself around you like a heavy blanket. It was a chilly October morning, and the wind howled through the cracks in the old windows, carrying with it the faint smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic. I clutched the keys in my hand, their weight feeling heavier than it should have, and stared into the dimly lit hallway that stretched before me. The realtor had called it quaint, but I could see the cracks in the plaster walls, the warped floorboards that creaked under my weight, and the faded wallpaper curling at the edges. Still, it was mine, after the divorce. I needed a place to start over, and this house, with its sagging roof and undeniable charm, seemed like the perfect fit for a fresh beginning. The moving truck arrived shortly after, and I spent the day hauling boxes into rooms I hadn't yet decided how to use. The living room was a decent size, though the fireplace had been bricked up years ago. The kitchen smelled faintly of onions, though I couldn't figure out why, and the upstairs bedrooms were drafty, with windows that seemed permanently fogged. As the day slipped into evening, I stood in the middle of the small dining room, surveying my new home. The shadows stretched long across the floor, and the dim overhead light flickered occasionally, as if protesting the strain of illuminating this old place. The first night passed uneventfully, though I woke up twice to what I thought were footsteps in the hallway. I dismissed it as the old house settling, a phrase I'd heard 100 times from friends who warned me about buying an older property. Still, I double-checked the locks before crawling back into bed. The next morning, I met Mrs. Langley, my next-door neighbor. She was an elderly woman with a wiry frame and a voice like gravel. She introduced herself as she watered the patchy rose bushes lining her walkway. "You're brave," she said with a crooked smile, her eyes lingering on my house. "Brave?" I asked, leaning against the fence that divided our yards. "Most folks don't last long in there," she replied, her tone casual but her gaze sharp. "Always something about that place. People hearing things, seeing things. You know, nonsense like that." I laughed, though it felt forced. "Well, I'm not superstitious. It's just an old house." Mrs. Langley didn't laugh. She just nodded slowly and turned back to her roses. "Old houses hold memories," she said over her shoulder. "Not all of them good." That afternoon, as I unpacked, I couldn't shake her words. Memories. I wandered through the house, running my fingers along the banister and opening cabinets that hadn't been touched in years. The previous owners had left a few things behind. A cracked porcelain doll in the upstairs closet, a stack of yellowing newspapers in the attic, and an old mirror propped against the wall in the guest room. The mirror unnerved me the most. Its surface was cloudy, and the ornate frame was carved with twisting vines and small faces, their expressions caught somewhere between anguish and glee. I decided to leave it where it was. By nightfall, I was exhausted. I collapsed onto the worn couch. I dragged into the living room and flicked on the TV for some background noise. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the loose shutters and whistling through the gaps in the window panes. I wrapped myself in a blanket, trying to ignore the faint creaking coming from upstairs. At one point, I thought I heard a door slam, but when I went to check, everything was as I'd left it. Still, the feeling of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. I told myself it was just nerves, the stress of the move, and the strangeness of being alone in a new place. But as I climbed into bed that night, I couldn't ignore the faint sound of whispering coming from the vents. The whispering had to be the wind. That's what I told myself as I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling. The sound was faint, just on the edge of perception, like a conversation heard through a wall. I pressed my ear against the vent next to my bed, my breath caught in my throat, straining to make sense of it. Nothing, just a faint hum of the heating system kicking on. I shook my head and laughed at myself. It was an old house. The vents probably carried sounds from somewhere else in the house, or maybe even from outside. Still, it took me longer than I'd like to admit to fall asleep, and even then, my dreams were restless. The next morning, I threw myself into unpacking. The sooner the house felt like mine, the sooner the unease would fade, or so I hoped. I tackled the kitchen first, lining the shelves with mismatched dishes and finding spots for pots and pans. I just started wiping down the counters when I caught a faint whiff of something acrid. It was sharp, like burning hair, and it seemed to come and go in waves. I checked the stove, the trash, even the drains, but I couldn't find the source. Eventually, the smell faded, leaving me with a dull headache and a vague sense of unease. Mrs. Langley's words echoed in my mind as I worked. Asterisk, old houses hold memories. Asterisk, I dismissed the thought and moved on to the living room. By mid-afternoon, I'd made decent progress and decided to reward myself with a walk through the neighborhood. The street was quiet, lined with other old houses, each with its own peculiar charm. Some were well kept, with neat gardens and fresh coats of paint. Others, like mine, seemed to sag under the weight of time. I passed a young couple walking their dog, a man raking leaves, and a woman in a floral dress who waved from her porch. On my way back, I noticed something odd about my house. From the sidewalk, the windows seemed darker than they should have been, as if the house was swallowing the light. I chalked it up to the overcast sky and the old glass, but it unsettled me all the same. That evening, as I settled into the couch with a bowl of soup and a book, the creaking started again. It wasn't constant, just an occasional groan from the floorboards upstairs, like someone shifting their weight. I glanced at the ceiling, half expecting to see shadows moving, but it was just my imagination running wild. I set the book down and stood, debating whether to investigate. Logic told me there was nothing to find, but curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and headed upstairs. The hallway was colder than the rest of the house, and the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I checked each room, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. Nothing was out of place, but as I turned to head back downstairs, I caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I whipped the flashlight around, my heart pounding. The beam landed on the old mirror in the guest room, the one I decided to leave alone. The glass seemed to shimmer, though that was impossible. There was no light to reflect. I stepped closer, my breath fogging the surface as I leaned in. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow that wasn't mine, moving just behind me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand, but the room was empty. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, but my voice sounded hollow, even to me. I hurried back downstairs, leaving the guest room door slightly ajar. I told myself I'd deal with the mirror later. The night passed in fits and starts. I woke up several times to faint noises. The creak of floorboards, the soft thud of something falling, the faint hum of whispering through the vents. Each time, I convinced myself it was the house settling or my imagination playing tricks. But by morning, I was exhausted. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors I was certain I'd closed were found open. Objects seemed to move on their own. Nothing dramatic, just little things like a mug shifting an inch on the counter or a book falling off the shelf. The smell of burning hair returned, stronger this time, lingering in the upstairs hallway. I tried to distract myself by focusing on work, but the house refused to let me ignore it. One evening, as I sat at my desk in the small study, the sound of footsteps echoed from above. They were slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other. I froze, my pen hovering above the paper. The footsteps stopped directly above me. For a long moment, there was silence, and then came a soft knock, as if someone was tapping on the ceiling. I grabbed my phone and dialed Mrs. Langley. She answered on the third ring. "Hello." Her voice was gruff, but there was a note of curiosity. "It's me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Have you ever heard anything strange from my house? At night?" There was a long pause. "I told you, didn't I?" she said finally. "That place has a history. You're not the first to hear things." "What kind of history?" I pressed, my knuckles white as I gripped the phone. She sighed. "The man who built it, Robert Grayson, was a strange one. Into the occult, they say. Did all sorts of rituals up there in the attic. People say he brought something into the house, something that never left." I felt a chill run down my spine. "And what happened to him?" "He disappeared," she said simply. "Vanished without a trace. Some say he ran off. Others say whatever he was messing with got him. Either way, the house has never been right since." That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I sat in the living room, the flashlight clutched in my hand, and waited. By the time the sun rose, I was more exhausted than ever. Every creak and groan of the house felt amplified in the quiet of the night. Each sound a reminder that I wasn't alone, at least not entirely. I spent the morning researching Robert Grayson. Mrs. Langley's story had left me unsettled, and I needed to know more. Sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of cold coffee, I scoured old newspaper archives online. The search yielded little at first, just a few mentions of his work as an architect and his reputation as a bit of an eccentric. But then I stumbled upon an article from the late 1920s. "Local architect missing. Robert Grayson vanishes from family home." The accompanying photo showed a gaunt man in his late 30s with sharp cheekbones and piercing eyes. The article detailed his sudden disappearance and how neighbors had reported strange lights and sounds coming from the house in the days leading up to it. One line stood out to me. "Rumors persist that Grayson was involved in occult practices, with some claiming he sought to open a doorway to another realm. Authorities have dismissed these claims as sensationalism." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. A doorway to another realm? It sounded absurd, but the unease that had been building in my chest refused to fade. That afternoon, I decided to explore the attic. If Robert Grayson had been performing rituals, it would have been there. The thought of going up into the dark, dusty space made my stomach churn, but curiosity won out over fear. I grabbed a flashlight and pulled down the creaky attic ladder. The air up there was stifling, thick with the scent of mildew and dust. The only light came from the beam of my flashlight, which illuminated piles of old furniture, boxes, and cobwebs. I picked my way through the clutter, the floorboards groaning under my weight. Toward the back of the attic, I found something that made my breath catch, a large, circular symbol painted on the wooden floor. The paint was faded, but the intricate design was still clear. Overlapping circles, strange runes, and what looked like a star at the center. Surrounding the symbol were melted candle stubs and a pile of ash that might once have been paper. My hands trembled as I crouched to get a closer look. The symbol was unlike anything I'd ever seen, and it exuded a strange energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Grayson, what were you doing up here?" I muttered. As I examined the ashes, I found something buried within them, a small leather-bound journal. Its edges were singed and the cover was brittle, but the pages inside were mostly intact. The handwriting was cramped and difficult to read, but I could make out enough to know I'd found something important. I carried the journal back downstairs and spent the rest of the day poring over it. Grayson's entries were fragmented and cryptic, full of references to the veil and crossing the threshold. He described hearing voices that guided him, instructing him on how to prepare the rituals. One entry, dated just days before his disappearance, made my blood run cold. "The doorway is almost ready. The whispers grow stronger, urging me forward. I've seen glimpses of what lies beyond, and it is magnificent. But I must be careful. The entity on the other side is powerful, and it demands respect. If I falter, if I make a mistake, the consequences will be dire." I slammed the journal shut, my pulse racing. The idea of someone willingly summoning something into this house was almost too much to bear. But as much as I wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a delusional man, I couldn't ignore the strange occurrences I'd experienced. That night, I heard the footsteps again. They started in the attic, slow and deliberate, before moving down the stairs. I lay frozen in bed, clutching the covers to my chest as the steps reached the hallway outside my room. Then came the knock. Soft at first, just a gentle tap on the door. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence so profound it felt deafening. I waited, my heart pounding, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to get out of bed. I opened the door, flashlight in hand, and shone the beam into the hallway. It was empty, but as I turned to go back to bed, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't belong. It was tall and hunched, standing at the end of the hallway near the attic door. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I called Mrs. Langley again. "Has anyone ever seen anything in this house?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment before answering. "You mean like a presence?" "Yes, there have been stories," she admitted. One tenant said she saw a man standing in her bedroom, just staring at her. Another said he felt something grab his ankle while he was sleeping. And there was that one family. They left in the middle of the night, didn't even bother to pack. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" "You wouldn't have believed me," she said simply. She was probably right. But now, I had no choice but to believe. I decided to stay out of the house for the rest of the day. I walked aimlessly through town, trying to clear my head. But when I returned that evening, something was waiting for me. The journal was open on the coffee table, even though I was certain I'd left it closed. And written in the margin of one of the pages, in handwriting that wasn't mine, were 3 words. "It's not over." The journal's words echoed in my mind all night. It's not over. It felt as though they were mocking me, taunting me with something I didn't understand. It was the kind of message that stuck with you, gnawing at the back of your mind until it drove you to the brink of madness. I spent most of the night staring at the journal, trying to make sense of it. How had it opened on its own? How had the words appeared on the page? I hadn't written them, and there was no one else in the house. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something far worse. What if this wasn't just some old man's ramblings? What if Robert Grayson had truly opened a door to something beyond this world? The fear started to sink in, creeping along the edges of my consciousness like an infection I couldn't stop. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to find them by hiding in the dark corners of the house. waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself. The next morning, I went to the town library. It was a small place, tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of library that smelled like old books and wood polish. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Klein, had been there for as long as I could remember. I figured if anyone knew something about the house or its history, it would be her. "What can I help you with, dear?" she asked, looking over her glasses. "I'm doing some research on a house in town, number 417 Grayson Street. Do you know anything about it?" Her face shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of recognition before it was quickly masked by a smile. "Oh, that house. Not much to tell, I'm afraid. It's old, and no one really stays there long. Why do you ask?" I hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I think something strange is happening there. I found a journal belonging to the original owner, Robert Grayson. It talks about rituals, about opening a doorway to another realm." Mrs. Klein's eyes widened, her smile faltering. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You really believe that?" I nodded, feeling the weight of her gaze on me. "I've heard stories," she said slowly, lowering her voice even further, "about Grayson and his practices. But I never thought anyone would actually go looking for the truth. He was obsessed with the occult, always talking about spirits and forces beyond our understanding. He kept to himself mostly. People thought he was crazy, but some of the older folks still remember the way he disappeared. No trace. Like he just vanished into thin air." I leaned in, desperate for more information. "Did anyone ever find out what happened to him, or what he was doing?" Mrs. Klein glanced around, as if checking to see if anyone was listening, then lowered her voice. "There's a rumor that he didn't vanish. Not entirely. Some believe that when he opened the door, something came through with him. Something that's been waiting in the house ever since." Her words sent a chill down my spine. The idea that whatever had haunted Grayson still lingered in the house, that it was somehow connected to him. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was getting closer to something I couldn't fully understand. "Is there anything at all, that could explain what happened to him? Any documents, books, or records?" She seemed to think for a moment. "There might be something in the town archives. Old records about Grayson's dealings, perhaps. But I don't know if you'll find much more than what you already know. Just be careful, dear. People who look too deep, they don't always come back the same." Her cryptic warning didn't help my nerves, but it made me more determined. I thanked her and made my way to the town's archives. It was a dusty, dimly lit room at the back of the library, filled with old newspapers and records that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. The smell of mildew hung in the air, and the shelves groaned under the weight of forgotten history. I spent hours combing through the files, but most of what I found only deepened the mystery. There were no direct references to any occult practices, but there were hints, subtle mentions of strange occurrences, inexplicable noises, people who had lived in the house and quickly moved away, often in the dead of night. The deeper I dug, the more unsettling it became. Then, in a forgotten file labeled Grayson Estate, I found something that caught my eye, a copy of Robert Grayson's last will and testament. It seemed ordinary at first, but something about the wording made me pause. Near the end, there was a peculiar clause that stood out. "I bequeath my estate to whoever can truly understand what lies within these walls." The house is not just a building, but a gateway, a door, if you will, to what I cannot say. But you must listen, and you must be prepared for what you will find. Only then will you understand the true purpose of this place. I sat there, staring at the words, my mind racing. Grayson's will didn't make sense. How could a house be a gateway? But the more I thought about it, the more everything started to fall into place. The strange noises, the footsteps, the cold spots. It all pointed to something far worse than I'd originally imagined. I spent the next few hours going over the rest of the files in a daze. But there was nothing more. No new revelations, no answers. It felt like the town itself was trying to bury the truth, to keep it hidden behind layers of old papers and forgotten history. When I returned to the house later that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. The house seemed darker, more oppressive. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of decay. As I walked through the front door, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, but this time there was something else, something I hadn't heard before. A low, guttural whisper, like a voice in the dark, speaking words I couldn't understand. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Robert?" I called out shakily, hoping to get a response. But nothing came. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. And then nothing. Absolute silence. I stepped back, but the floor beneath me groaned, the boards creaking under my weight as though something was shifting below. I turned toward the stairs, and that's when I saw it. At the top, a figure, faint and blurry, as though it were made of smoke, stood watching me. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It just stood there, as if waiting for me to make the first move. And then, with a sudden rush of adrenaline, I ran. But as I passed the hallway, the air turned cold, frigid, like stepping into an icebox. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could hear the footsteps behind me, now louder, more insistent. I bolted up the stairs, toward my bedroom. The figure was still there, watching me, and that's when I knew for sure the house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The air in the house felt thick with something malevolent, something ancient. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside seemed to carry a warning. I kept the lights on, all of them, and even then, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The feeling that I was being watched never left me, and the quiet whispers continued, soft and indistinct, always just beyond my comprehension. I tried to tell myself that it was my mind playing tricks on me, that the stress of everything, the move, the house, the journal, was getting to me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something was very wrong, and it wasn't just the house's age or the odd sounds. The figure from the stairs kept replaying in my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the wind outside. But when I closed my eyes, I saw it again, standing at the top of the stairs, watching me with cold, unblinking eyes. The next day, I decided to take another look at Robert Grayson's journal. Maybe there was something I had missed, some small detail that could explain what was happening. I sat down at the kitchen table, the journal spread out before me, the candlelight flickering in the corner of my vision. As my fingers brushed over the pages, I realized something strange. The ink on the pages had started to fade, as though the words were being erased before my very eyes. I flipped to the last entry, the one I had read the night before, and my breath caught in my throat. The words had changed. Not alone. The door is open. It is coming. I cannot stop it. It cannot stop me. But you can. The chill in the room deepened, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over me. Who was it? What did Grayson mean by "you can"? It was as though the journal was speaking directly to me, but in a way that didn't make sense, like it was alive, changing to reflect whatever it wanted me to see. My mind raced. I had to get answers. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for whatever was to come for me next. I grabbed the journal and raced out of the house, my footsteps echoing through the empty street. I didn't know where I was going at first, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house for another second. The weight of it pressed on me, the sense of being hunted growing stronger with every passing moment. I found myself standing in front of the town archives once more, the heavy door creaking open as I stepped inside. Mrs. Klein was behind the counter, her face pale, her eyes wide. She looked as though she had seen a ghost. "You came back," she said, her voice tight. "I was hoping you wouldn't." I ignored her and walked straight to the back room. I needed more information, and I wasn't going to stop until I found it. Mrs. Klein followed me, her footsteps hesitant and unsure. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "There's something about that house, something that changes people. It's not just a house, not anymore. It's a prison, and once you're inside, you can't leave." I turned to her, my patience wearing thin. "What do you mean? What's really going on? What happened to Robert Grayson?" Her hands trembled as she clasped them together. "I shouldn't be telling you this," she murmured, "but you need to know the truth. Grayson didn't just dabble in the occult. He made a pact. He wasn't just trying to open a door to another world. He was trying to bring something through, something that shouldn't be here." "What was it?" I asked, my voice low. "What did he want?" Mrs. Klein shook her head. "I don't know. No one does. But I know this much. Whatever it was, it's still in that house. And it's waiting for someone to come back. You've opened the door by even looking for it. And now it's going to find you." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to ask more, to demand the answers, but the fear in her eyes made it clear that there was nothing more she could tell me. Whatever this thing was, it was far beyond anything we understood, and it had no intention of letting me walk away. "I have to go back," I whispered, more to myself than to her. Mrs. Klein grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "No, don't. You don't know what you're dealing with. The house, it's not just haunted. It's a place of power. And when you've opened the door, you've given it permission to come through. But I didn't listen. I couldn't. The need to understand, to know what was happening, was too strong. The fear, the paranoia, the whispers, they wouldn't stop until I knew the truth. And so, I walked out of the library, the door slamming behind me with a finality that made my stomach churn. When I returned to the house, the silence hit me first. It was oppressive, thick with something I couldn't name. The lights flickered as I stepped through the front door, and for a moment, I thought I heard the whispering again, distant and indistinct. But then, something changed. The air grew colder, and the floorboards beneath me groaned, like a heavy weight was pressing down from above. I could feel something moving, watching, waiting. I hurried up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The bedroom door creaked open on its own, and I stepped inside, the familiar chill greeting me. And there, sitting on the bed, was a figure from before. It was clearer now, its shape more defined, its eyes hollow pits of darkness. "You shouldn't have come back," it whispered, its voice cold and distorted, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I froze. But then, before I could move, the figure lunged at me and I screamed, falling back into the darkness. I woke up on the floor, cold sweat sticking my clothes to my skin. The room was silent now, unnervingly so. My heart raced, each beat heavy in my chest, as though it were trying to escape the confines of my ribcage. The darkness in the room felt oppressive, like it had weight, like it was holding me down. I could still feel the lingering presence of whatever had been sitting on the bed, but when I opened my eyes, there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, just an empty, suffocating room. I pulled myself to my feet, my legs weak beneath me. My hands trembled as I wiped the sweat from my brow, trying to steady my breath. Was it real? Had I imagined the whole thing? Or had it been some manifestation of the terror that had been consuming me for days? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my mind. No, that was real. It had been real. I couldn't deny it any longer. The house, the whispers, the figure, it was all connected. And whatever it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I couldn't stay here any longer. But as I stepped toward the door, ready to leave, a voice echoed in my mind. A voice that wasn't my own. A whisper so faint I almost couldn't hear it, but still there, telling me to stay, to finish what I had started. I stopped in my tracks, my hand frozen on the doorknob. My mind screamed at me to run. to get out before it was too late. But the voice was persistent. It urged me on, coaxing me to uncover the truth, to face the darkness. With a shaky breath, I pulled my hand away from the door and turned back to the room. I had to know more. I had to understand what had happened to Robert Grayson, what he had unleashed. I grabbed the journal from the bedside table, flipping through its pages with frantic urgency. But this time, something was different. The words were no longer fading. They were shifting, rearranging themselves, as if the journal were writing itself in front of my eyes. I froze, watching in horror as the ink began to change, to form new words, new entries. "It has found you," the journal read. "It is closer than you think. The door is open, and now it is waiting for you to come through." I slammed the book shut, panic flooding my veins. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. The journal was right. It wasn't just a house. It was the thing that had been set free. And now, it was coming for me. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing in like they were alive. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony in my ears. My skin prickled with cold, and I could feel the presence again, just behind me, just out of sight. I spun around, but the room was empty, the bed untouched, the air still. Yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I didn't know how much more I could take. The paranoia, the fear, it was all consuming me. But I knew I had to act. I had to confront whatever was here before it swallowed me whole. I rushed out of the room and down the hall, my footsteps heavy in the silence. I needed to find the source of the evil that had taken root in this house. I needed to finish what Grayson had started. I made my way to the basement, the last place I had yet to explore. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing a dark, musty staircase leading into the unknown. I hesitated for a moment, a cold chill running down my spine, but then I forced myself to take a step, then another, until I reached the bottom. The basement was worse than I had imagined. The air was thick, the smell of rot and decay overwhelming. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with jars of odd, unidentifiable substances. Books and papers were scattered across the floor, as though they had been thrown in haste. But what caught my eye was the center of the room. In the middle of the floor, there was a large, circular symbol painted in red, its edges jagged and uneven. At its center, a blackened, burnt mark lingered, as though something had been set alight and left to smolder. I couldn't move. The room seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing against my chest. My breath quickened, and my hands shook as I took a step forward, compelled by some force I couldn't resist. I had to see more. I had to know what this place had been used for. As I reached the symbol, my foot brushed against something soft and cold. I looked down to find a worn, leather-bound book lying at my feet. The cover was unmarked, but as I bent down to pick it up, the temperature in the room plummeted. A sharp, guttural growl echoed through the basement, sending a surge of terror through my body. I whirled around, but the room was still empty. The growl had come from nowhere, yet it was everywhere, vibrating through my bones. I stumbled backward, clutching the book to my chest. I had to leave. I had to get out. But as I turned toward the stairs, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the top of the stairs stood a figure, just like the one I had seen before. The shadowy figure, its eyes black pits of nothingness. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its gaze on me, as though it was waiting for me to make a move. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind screaming at me to run. But my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The figure took a step forward, then another, and another, until it was standing right in front of me, its cold, empty gaze locking onto mine. The growl grew louder, more ferocious. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but there was no escape. I had opened the door, and now it was too late to close it. Then, the figure spoke, its voice low and hollow, like the whispering winds of a long-forgotten grave. "Welcome home." The air was suffocating as the figure loomed over me, its presence overwhelming. I could feel the weight of its gaze, like a cold hand wrapping around my throat, tightening with every passing second. My legs felt like lead, and my heart pounded so hard it seemed to echo in the silence of the basement. "Who? What are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure did not answer immediately. It stood still, as if contemplating my question, its dark, hollow eyes never leaving mine. Then it stepped forward, and with each step, the temperature dropped further, the cold seeping into my skin, into my very bones. "Who I am is not important," it said, its voice a chilling rasp that sent shivers down my spine. "What matters is, you are the next." I recoiled, the words hitting me like a physical blow. It didn't make sense. None of it did. I tried to take a step back, but my feet felt stuck to the ground, as if some invisible force was holding me in place. "You've awakened what was buried," the figure continued, its tone growing colder, more deliberate. "What Grayson unleashed was never meant to be contained. And now, it seeks a new vessel, a new soul. Yours." I felt my breath catch in my throat. Grayson, the name echoed in my mind like a distant memory, a warning I should have heeded. The house, the rituals, the curse. It was all connected. I had been drawn here unknowingly to complete what had been started all those years ago. The figure took another step, and this time I could feel the air around me shift, thickening, as though the very space was becoming heavier. I glanced back at the stairs, but they seemed miles away, as if the house itself had grown larger, more oppressive. I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. Panic surged through me, my chest tightening as I gasped for air. This wasn't just fear. It was something worse, something primal, as though my very existence was under threat. "You can't escape," the figure hissed, its voice now sharp, filled with malice. "It's already too late." The shadows around it seemed to writhe, stretching out like tendrils, reaching toward me. I could feel them, cold and grasping, brushing against my skin. The growling sound, low and guttural, filled the air again, vibrating through the walls, through my very bones. It was coming from everywhere, surrounding me. The figure raised a hand, and I saw it, an ancient symbol, carved into its palm. It glowed with an eerie, greenish light, pulsating in rhythm with the growl. The room seemed to darken even more, and I could feel the very ground beneath me shaking, as if the house itself was alive, trembling in response to the figure's power. Desperation clawed at me. I had to do something. I couldn't let it take me. I couldn't let it complete whatever twisted ritual Grayson had started. But what could I do? I had no power against this thing. No weapon. Nothing. Then my eyes fell on the journal. The book. The one I had found earlier. It was still clutched in my hands, and in a moment of blind instinct, I opened it. The pages were filled with cryptic symbols, strange writings, and descriptions of rituals, some of which were too disturbing to comprehend. But there, at the very end, was something that caught my eye. A single sentence, written in bold, black ink. "To stop what has been started, you must return what was taken." I didn't know what it meant, but the words seemed to resonate deep within me. I had no idea how to return what had been taken, or what had been taken in the first place, but it felt like a thread of hope, a lifeline. I ripped the journal open further, searching frantically for more. But before I could find anything else, the figure took another step forward, its cold breath washing over me like a tidal wave. "You're wasting time," it growled. "You're already mine." The shadows around it swirled faster, and I felt the pressure building in my chest. It was suffocating. The air was thick with dread, and the walls seemed to close in on me. The floor beneath me trembling as if the house itself was being pulled into something dark. I had no choice. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't run. But maybe, just maybe, I could delay it. I closed my eyes, my hands trembling as I turned the journal in my grasp. I had to focus, had to think. What had Grayson done? What had he left behind that could stop this? Suddenly, a memory flashed through my mind. The symbol in the basement, the one I had seen earlier, the one painted in red. It had to mean something. It had to be a part of the ritual. I turned, my eyes locking onto the symbol on the floor, still faintly glowing with that unnatural red light. There was something familiar about it, something I had seen before in the journal. The shapes, the lines, the angles, the figure hissed, its form flickering as if it were growing impatient, angry. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the symbol. The journal was still open in my hands, and I could hear the pages rustling as if they were alive, urging me on. With trembling hands, I dropped the journal onto the ground beside the symbol, the pages fluttering open to the last entry. It was a desperate plea, a last attempt to undo the horrors that had been unleashed. Grayson had known. He had known that the only way to stop the curse was to return something that had been taken long ago. But what had been taken? What had Grayson stolen from this place? I closed my eyes, trying to center myself, trying to pull the fog of panic away. The house seemed to hold its breath, the shadows swirling around me, waiting. Then, as if guided by some unseen force, I reached down and pressed my hand against the symbol. The moment I touched it, the room exploded in a rush of cold, an overwhelming pressure squeezing my chest as if I were being crushed by an invisible hand. A sound, like 1,000 whispers, filled the air, voices overlapping, speaking in tongues, in languages I didn't understand. The figure screamed, its form distorting and twisting, like smoke being sucked into a vacuum. The shadows writhed and recoiled, shrinking back from the symbol. I pulled my hand away, gasping for air, my body weak with exhaustion. The figure was gone. The room was still. But the silence that followed was deafening. The oppressive feeling that had hung in the air lifted, leaving behind an eerie stillness. I didn't know what had happened. Had I stopped it, or had I only delayed the inevitable? I stumbled toward the stairs, my legs shaky, my mind spinning. The house was quiet now, too quiet. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I could hear it again, the faintest sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. Until next time, the whisper echoed in my ears as I stumbled into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. I froze, a cold shiver crawling down my spine. It wasn't the sound of the wind or a creak in the floorboards. No, this was something different, something alive. It was the same voice, low and taunting, like it had been waiting for me to hear it. Until next time, I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. After everything that had happened, my mind was likely playing tricks on me, but the words lingered heavy in the air, refusing to fade. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this house, this nightmare, and never look back. My hand gripped the railing as I ascended the stairs, my legs weak beneath me, my breath shallow and ragged. The front door was just a few steps away, but I could already feel it, the weight of something following me, something that hadn't been banished. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could turn it, a loud thud echoed from downstairs, so powerful it seemed to vibrate through the entire house. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I stood frozen in place. Then, I heard it again, footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, each step like a hammer driving nails into my skull. Heavy, unnatural, a sound that didn't belong in this house. I had to leave. I had to, but my feet wouldn't move. Fear, pure and unrelenting, gripped me. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. The footsteps were closer now, growing louder with each passing second. My hands trembled as I pressed against the door, pushing with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck, locked in place, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. The footsteps were at the bottom of the stairs now. I turned away from the door, my eyes scanning the hallway, looking for any escape. There was none. The walls seemed to close in, the narrow passageways growing tighter as though the house itself was trapping me. The air was thick, suffocating, as if it was becoming harder to breathe with each passing second. A cold draft swept through the hallway, biting at my skin. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself, but the cold only intensified. The footsteps continued, moving up the stairs now, slow and deliberate, closer with every heartbeat. I could hear the creak of each step, the scrape of something dragging along the floor. It wasn't human. Whatever it wasn't human. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My eyes darted to the door at the far end of the hallway. Another exit, a back door. I had to get to it. I had no choice. But as I turned to run, the lights flickered, plunging the hallway into darkness. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I cursed under my breath, feeling my way along the walls as I moved toward the door. But then another thud, this time closer, much closer. It came from the room right next to me, the one with the old wooden door, the door that had always seemed to be a little too still. The air was thick with dread. I had to get out, but curiosity, sick, twisted curiosity, kept me rooted in place. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling, as the footsteps continued their slow, methodical climb up the stairs. What was waiting for me on the other side of that door? I turned the knob, the door creaking open with a sound that made my blood run cold. The room was dark, and the air inside felt wrong, stale, heavy, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. I could barely make out the outlines of furniture, but there was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was a smell. It hit me all at once, earthy, damp with a faint, metallic undertone. It was a smell of decay. I stepped inside, my heart racing as the darkness seemed to swallow me whole. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I saw them. Old symbols, painted hastily on the walls in what looked like dried blood. The room was covered in them. They were everywhere, on the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. They seemed to writhe in the low light, pulsing alive. Then I saw it, the thing that made my stomach lurch with terror. A book. It lay open on a pedestal in the center of the room, the pages worn and yellowed with age. The writing was strange, twisted, as if someone had written it in a hurry, their hands shaking. The symbols on the walls matched the ones in the book, the same symbols that had been in Grayson's journal. And that's when I realized Grayson hadn't been the only one obsessed with the occult. The house itself had become a vessel for something much darker. The rituals, the curses, the whispered promises, they had all been part of something bigger, something ancient. Before I could take another step, I heard it again. The footsteps. They were just outside the door now. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I knew, in that moment, that whatever had haunted this house was no longer confined to the shadows. It had found me. It was coming for me. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The footsteps were still there, getting closer, their heavy weight pounding on the floor, reverberating through my bones. I ran for the back door, but it was too late. I could feel it behind me, creeping closer, its presence suffocating. Whatever it was, whatever had been awakened, it was no longer interested in hiding in the shadows. It was hunting me. The back door was locked. Panic surged through me as I yanked at the handle, feeling the cold metal bite into my palm. My breathing grew more erratic with each failed attempt to escape. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel the presence, thick and suffocating, pressing against me from every side. I turned in desperation, looking for anything that might help me break free. The walls seemed to close in, their old, creaking timbers groaning under the weight of the silence. The house was alive, breathing with me, as though it were feeding on my fear. I could hear it now, a faint, scratching noise from behind me, like nails dragging across wood. It came from the other side of the hallway, where the door to the basement stood, looming in the dim light. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct screamed at me to avoid it, to turn and run in the opposite direction. But I had no choice. The front door was still stuck, and the back door, well, I had already tried that. I had to get out, and the basement was the only way. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat as I moved toward the basement door. The house was quiet, too quiet, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for me to make my next move. The closer I got, the more I could feel it, the pressure building in the air, pressing against my chest. The darkness below seemed to stretch endless, like a gaping mouth ready to swallow me whole. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The air around me grew colder, and the scratching sound returned, louder now, more frantic. It wasn't just a noise anymore. It was something desperate, something clawing to get out. And then I saw it, a shape. It was standing at the bottom of the stairs, just out of reach of the light. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me. I don't know why I didn't scream. I don't know why I didn't turn and run the other way. Maybe it was the fear, numbing my senses. Or maybe it was curiosity, that sickening pull to know what was down there, what was waiting for me in the darkness. I took a step forward. The shape didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking, like two black holes in the dark. Another step. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight, and I winced at the sound, as though it would alert whatever was watching me. But still, the shape remained motionless. I reached the bottom of the stairs, the darkness swallowing me whole. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of mildew and something else, something rotten. I had to get through it. I had to find out what was causing this. It had to be in the basement, didn't it? Everything pointed to it. There was a faint glow ahead, the dim light from an old bulb, hanging low from the ceiling, flickered intermittently. I could barely make out the outlines of shelves and old furniture stacked in the corners. But there was something else. Something I couldn't see, but I could feel it like a pulse, a vibration in the air. The scratching sound was louder now, closer, coming from the far corner of the room. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath shallow and quick. The noise was unmistakable now. Something, or someone, was dragging itself across the floor. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it in my bones. I stumbled backward, my hand slamming into the wall as I tried to get away. But I couldn't turn. I couldn't run. The door had disappeared. The walls were closing in. The only thing left was a corner, where the scratching continued. And then it stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, makes your blood run cold and your skin prickle. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs were locked in place, as though the house itself had reached out and frozen me in this moment. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, any movement, but there was nothing, only the stifling, suffocating air. It was as if whatever had been there had vanished, retreating into the shadows to wait for the next moment of weakness. That's when I heard it, a voice. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder with every passing second, until it filled the entire room. It was guttural, low, and unfamiliar. Leave, now. The words were barely audible, but they hit me like a wave, crashing over me with such force that I staggered back. I tried to speak, tried to call out, but no sound came from my mouth. The room was spinning, the walls bending in on themselves, and for a split second, I thought I might faint. Then the light flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. I stood in the dark, frozen. The temperature in the basement dropped, the air turning icy as my breath came out in visible puffs. I could hear the sound of something moving toward me, slow, deliberate steps, closer, closer, until I could feel it, standing right behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. Then a hand, cold, damp, like death itself, pressed against my shoulder. I screamed, but when I spun around, there was nothing there. Just the darkness, just the suffocating silence that filled the basement, stretching out into eternity. The cold lingered, though. It stuck to my skin, clinging to me as I backed away, desperately feeling for the stairs, the light, the safety of the house's exit. I needed to leave. Now, I stumbled up the stairs, my legs shaking beneath me, and when I reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut, my hands still trembling from the touch of whatever had been there. But as I stood in the hallway, gasping for breath, I knew something else. Whatever was in this house wasn't finished with me. It was still here. It was waiting. I had to get out. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The house seemed to be alive, humming with an energy I couldn't understand. Every creak, every groan of the walls, felt like it was being whispered directly into my ears, a reminder that I wasn't alone. I sat in the living room, trying to focus on anything other than the house. The sound of my own breathing, shallow and erratic, filled the space. The air was thick, and the silence was maddening. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, but inside, the atmosphere was still, too still. I tried to distract myself. I turned on the television, though I couldn't tell you what was on. My mind kept wandering back to the basement, to that cold hand on my shoulder, the voice that had whispered to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, still waiting for the right moment to come for me. Around 2 a.m., a knock came at the door. I froze. It wasn't a loud knock. In fact, it was almost too soft, too gentle, as if whoever was on the other side didn't want to be heard. My heart leapt into my throat, and I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just a figment of my imagination. But it came again, a slow, deliberate knock, followed by the soft sound of breathing. I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind raced. Who would be here at this hour? The neighbor, maybe. They had told me to watch out for the house, to be careful. Could it be them checking on me? But then I remembered. The neighbor had warned me that there had been no one living here for months before I moved in. The house had been empty. No one came to visit it. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and clutched it tightly in my hands. Slowly, I crept toward the door, my every step cautious, my ears straining to catch the slightest sound. But there was nothing. No more knocks. No more breathing. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I touched the handle. I wanted to look through the peephole, but I couldn't bring myself to. The house seemed to be pushing against me, urging me to open it, to step into whatever lay outside. I took a deep breath and pulled the door open. Nothing. The porch was empty, bathed in the dim light from the street lamp. There was no one there, not a single soul. I stood frozen in the doorway for a long time, my eyes darting back and forth, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, not even the faintest trace of footsteps in the dust. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. The air was cold, biting, and I wrapped my arms around myself for warmth. The house loomed behind me, its silhouette dark against the night sky. The wind picked up, causing the trees to sway and creak, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I turned to head back inside, something caught my eye. There, by the edge of the porch, just beyond the reach of the street lamp, was a figure. I could see it only for a moment. A shadow, tall and indistinct, standing perfectly still. My heart stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I wanted to call out, but my throat was dry, constricted. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the night. I stumbled back into the house, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had to get out of here. I had to leave before whatever was caught up with me. But the house had other plans. As I turned to make my way up the stairs to the bedroom, I heard something again, soft at first, almost imperceptible, but growing louder with each passing second. It was a slow, deliberate sound. Footsteps, heavy, dragging steps, coming from somewhere upstairs. I froze, my hand on the banister, my breath caught in my chest. The footsteps weren't mine. I knew that much, and they weren't the house settling either. No, these were real, and they were coming for me. I turned and ran toward the back door. I didn't even care anymore if it was locked. I had to get out, but as I reached the kitchen, the door slammed shut on its own, the sound of the lock clicking into place as though the house had made its choice for me. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, and stared at the stairs. The footsteps were coming closer. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. Every exit was blocked, every path leading me back into the house, into the grip of whatever was stalking me. And then a voice, soft and cold, drifted from the top of the stairs. Leave. It was the same voice I had heard earlier, the one that had whispered to me in the basement. But this time, it wasn't a warning. It was a command. I couldn't argue. I couldn't fight. My legs moved before I could even think, carrying me up the stairs, toward the source of the voice. I had to know what was waiting for me, had to see it with my own eyes. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw something I could never unsee. There, in the hallway, was the figure, the shadow that had been outside. It was standing in the middle of the hallway, blocking my way. I could see its face now, or rather, what remained of it. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Its mouth was open, stretched wide in a grotesque grin that seemed to mock me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. It took a step toward me, then another, and then it lunged. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran, but as I fled through the house, the darkness consumed me. It was everywhere, smothering, choking. I couldn't escape it. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it all went black. I awoke with a start, gasping for air, my chest tight and my head spinning. My eyes darted around the room. I was in my bed. How had I gotten here? The room was still eerily silent, and the weight of the blankets pressed down on me like a shroud. My hands trembled as I pushed the covers off, glancing around for any sign of movement. Nothing. It had been a nightmare, I told myself. Just a nightmare, a product of fear and exhaustion, of too many days spent living in a house that felt like it was trying to swallow me whole. But then I heard it. The sound, faint but unmistakable. A scraping noise, like nails dragging across wood. It came from the hallway, just outside the door. I held my breath, waiting, straining to hear. There was again, slow, deliberate, like something was dragging itself across the floor. I climbed out of bed, my legs shaky, and moved toward the door. Every instinct told me to run, to leave this place behind and never look back. But I couldn't. Something held me here, like a magnetic pull that I couldn't resist. I reached for the door handle, my hand freezing just above it as the scraping noise grew louder. It was followed by another sound, something I recognized instantly, footsteps. Heavy, slow, dragging, like someone or something was making its way down the hallway toward me. I stepped back from the door, heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the cold, suffocating presence on the other side, the sense that whatever it was waiting for me. And then, just as suddenly as the noise had started, it stopped. Silence. I waited. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand what was happening, what had happened to the house. But something in me knew, deep down I knew, that I wasn't alone. I cautiously opened the door, my breath hitching in my throat. The hallway was empty. Nothing was there. No dragging footsteps, no cold presence, no shadow standing in the doorway. Just the quiet stillness of the house. I stepped out into the hallway, my bare feet silent on the old wooden floor. The walls groaned and creaked as though the house itself was stretching. Waking up, I turned toward the stairs. I could feel something wrong, pulling me upward toward the attic. It was almost as if the house was calling to me, beckoning me to find the truth, to uncover whatever dark secrets it had buried beneath the layers of dust and decay. Without thinking, I started to climb the stairs. The closer I got to the top, the colder the air became. It felt like ice, a chill that went straight through my bones. I had to pause for a moment, my breath visible in the freezing air. The attic door was at the end of the hall, just ahead of me, and I could feel the weight of its presence, like it was waiting for me to open it. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to run away from whatever haunted this house, but my body moved forward against my will. I reached the door. The moment my hand touched the handle, a wave of dread washed over me, so intense that it nearly brought me to my knees. My stomach churned and my vision blurred, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I opened the door. The attic was dimly lit by a single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with dust, and the space smelled stale, musty, like it hadn't been touched in years. Old furniture was piled in corners, covered in sheets, and boxes filled with forgotten memories were scattered across the floor. But what caught my attention wasn't the dusty furniture or the old boxes. It was the journal. Sitting on a small wooden table in the center of the room, the journal was open, its pages yellowed with age. I didn't need to look at the title to know what it was. I could feel it, feel the weight of the history it held, the darkness trapped within its pages. I walked toward it, my heart pounding louder with each step. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing tighter, the air growing colder. I reached out and touched the journal. The moment my fingers brushed against the leather cover, the room seemed to shift. The air thickened, and a strange humming noise began to fill the space, like something ancient was waking up, stretching and reaching out from the darkness. I opened the journal. The first page was filled with strange symbols, circles and lines that seemed to twist and move, even as I stared at them. The writing that followed was in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow I understood it. It was a ritual, a dark incantation, a summoning. The house's original owner, the one obsessed with the occult, had opened a door, one that should never have been opened, a door to something beyond this world. I flipped through the pages, my hands trembling, until I reached the last entry. It was dated the day before the house had been abandoned. The words were frantic, almost desperate. Asterisk, they are here. I can hear them, feel them. The door is open and they are coming. I have to leave, but they won't let me go. I have to, asterisk. The rest of the sentence was smudged, as though the ink had been smeared with a shaking hand. I closed the journal, my heart racing. The humming grew louder. The air turned icy cold. I could feel something watching me, from somewhere deep in the shadows of the attic. And then I heard it, the dragging footsteps, slow, heavy, coming for me. The footsteps were unmistakable, louder now, echoing through the attic with a steady rhythm. My heart raced in my chest, pounding so loudly that I was sure whatever was in the room could hear it too. I stood frozen, my hands still clutching the journal, my feet rooted to the cold floor. The temperature had dropped so suddenly, my breath came out in visible clouds. But it wasn't just the cold. It was the presence, the feeling that something was there, something old, something angry. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it moving, inching closer, the floorboards groaning underfoot as if someone or something was dragging itself toward me. The scraping sound was more pronounced now, like nails on wood, desperate and relentless. I glanced around the room, searching for an escape. The narrow staircase was the only way out, but it felt miles away. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear, each breath a struggle against the overwhelming sense of dread. I looked at the journal in my hands. What was I supposed to do with it? What was I supposed to do with this knowledge that the house was cursed, that the door had been opened, and then a whisper? It was soft at first, barely audible, but as I focused, the words became clearer. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come. Asterisk, the voice was cold, almost like it was coming from the walls themselves, reverberating through the room. My body stiffened, my blood running cold. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. There was no one else in the attic, no one but me, and yet the voice seemed to echo, as though it had been there for a long time, waiting for me to discover its secrets. Asterisk, you should have stayed away. Now you'll join us. Asterisk, the words hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled back, almost dropping the journal. The air in the attic shifted, turning oppressive, like the very atmosphere was thickening, wrapping around me, pulling me down. A cold wind rushed past me, slamming the attic door shut with a force that rattled the walls. The room grew darker, the single light bulb flickering violently, casting long, twisted shadows across the space. I heard something breathing, slow, heavy breaths that were not my own, as though something was standing just behind me, its presence pressing against me, suffocating me. I turned around, my body trembling. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, forming shapes that moved in the corner of my vision. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something, and then I saw it, a figure, tall, slender, its face hidden in the darkness, but I could feel its eyes, cold, empty, like deep voids that could swallow me whole. It didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. Asterisk, you are not welcome here. Asterisk, the voice again, but this time, it came from the figure, low and guttural, like it was speaking through the darkness itself. I backed away, my body instinctively moving toward the stairs, but the figure didn't move. It remained still, like it was tied to the space, bound to the house in ways I couldn't understand. The footsteps began again, louder now, closer. Whatever it wasn't alone. I could hear the shuffle of multiple feet dragging across the floor, and I realized with growing horror that the figure wasn't the only one. There were others, creeping from the shadows, their forms indistinct but growing clearer as the darkness around them seemed to come alive. The air grew heavier, suffocating. My lungs burned as I gasped for breath, and for the first time, I truly understood what had happened to the previous tenants. They hadn't run out in fear for no reason. They had run because the house was alive, and once it had claimed you, it didn't let go. I stumbled backward toward the attic door, my hands shaking as I tried to turn the handle. It wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had locked me in. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a chorus of voices, all murmuring in a language I couldn't comprehend. But the meaning was clear. They were calling to me, urging me to join them in the dark. Asterisk, stay with us. Asterisk, asterisk, don't leave. Asterisk. The figure took a step forward, its limbs unnaturally long, its movements jerky and disjointed. Its face, if you could call it a face, was nothing but a shadow, empty and hollow, like a black void where a human face should have been. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat, my body paralyzed by terror. Suddenly, the door behind me creaked open. It wasn't the attic door, but the one leading down the stairs. I didn't hesitate. I turned and bolted toward the opening, my feet pounding against the stairs as I ran, desperate to escape whatever nightmare had been awakened in this cursed house. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing in the cold night air, my lungs burning, my heart racing. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I could still feel it watching, still feel the presence that had been waiting for me to open that door. I didn't know where I would go next. I didn't care. All I knew was that I could never return to that house. As I walked away, I heard it. The scraping noise again, distant but unmistakable. It was still waiting, and I knew deep down that it would always be waiting for the next person to move in. The The house would never be empty. It would never be quiet. It would never let go. Story 3. The house was everything I needed and nothing I wanted. A two-story Victorian tucked away on the edge of a sleepy town. Its faded white paint and weathered shutters gave it the look of a place that had seen better days. To me, it was just a place to start over. After the divorce, I wanted distance from everything that reminded me of my old life, and this house, with its affordable rent and quiet surroundings, seemed like a sign. A new beginning, wrapped in chipped wood and creaky floorboards. The first day I arrived, I remember standing in the overgrown yard with my single suitcase, staring up at the tall windows that seemed to stare back. It had been years since I'd lived alone. The idea of silence unnerved me, but I told myself it would be fine. A fresh start, I thought, even if the house itself felt off. The realtor had mentioned its quirks, a stubborn heating system, floors that groaned with age, and a slight draft no matter how well sealed the windows were. But she'd smiled brightly as she handed over the keys, assuring me it had character. I took it because the rent was low, and character, I decided, was better than living in a shoebox apartment in the city. The interior was as old-fashioned as the exterior. High ceilings, intricate molding, and an ornate banister that spiraled up to the second floor. But the smell hit me first, something faintly sour like damp wood. It wasn't overwhelming, just enough to make me wrinkle my nose. I told myself it was nothing a few candles couldn't fix. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent my time unpacking, exploring the house, and settling into a routine. The kitchen, with its outdated appliances and peeling wallpaper, became my favorite spot. It had a cozy nook by the window where I could sip coffee and watch the world outside. A slow trickle of neighbors walking dogs or kids riding bikes. One of the neighbors introduced herself on the third day. Her name was Mrs. Harris, a cheerful woman in her 60s who lived across the street. She had a warm smile and a plate of cookies, which she handed over as soon as I opened the door. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, peering over my shoulder at the interior of the house. "You're brave, taking on this old thing. It's got history." I laughed nervously, unsure what she meant. "It's a bit run down, but I think it'll grow on me." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Just you in there?" "Yes, just me," I replied, and for some reason, saying it out loud sent a small shiver down my spine. She hesitated, as if weighing her words. "Well, if you need anything, I'm just across the way. Some folks around here say that house has seen its share of strange things. But you know how people like to talk." "Strange things?" I pressed, more curious than concerned. She waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, just silly stories. It's an old house. Creaky floors, weird noises, that sort of thing." I wouldn't pay it any mind. Her words lingered in my head long after she left. I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, but something about the way she said it. It felt like she wasn't telling me everything. That night, the house seemed louder than usual. Every creak and groan of the floorboards was amplified in the quiet. I tried to brush it off, blaming the house's age. But as I lay in bed, I could have sworn I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving down the hall outside my room. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. It was probably just the house settling, I told myself, but I locked my bedroom door before lying back down. By the end of the first week, I was beginning to notice other oddities. The draft, which I'd expected, seemed to follow me, no matter which room I was in. The smell, faint at first, grew stronger in the evenings, like something rotting deep within the walls. And then there was the attic. I hadn't ventured up there yet, mostly because the narrow staircase leading to it looked like it could collapse under my weight. But every so often, I'd catch a strange sound from above, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I asked Mrs. Harris about it the next time I saw her. The attic? Oh, dear, I wouldn't spend too much time up there if I were you. That's where the last tenant. She trailed off, her smile faltering. What about the last tenant? She hesitated. Well, they left in quite a hurry, poor thing. Something about bad dreams and strange noises. But, like I said, people around here like to talk. I'm sure it's nothing. Her words didn't comfort me. That night, as I lay in bed, the footsteps returned. Heavier this time, like boots stomping across the floor. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the ceiling, heart hammering. Just the house, I whispered to myself, gripping the blankets tightly. Just the house? But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. I spent the next morning convincing myself that I'd imagined the footsteps. Houses like this were always full of sounds. Creaking floorboards, shifting beams, wind seeping through the cracks. It was nothing, I told myself, just an old house doing old house things. But the explanation didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the memory of those heavy, deliberate steps, the way they echoed in the stillness of the night. It was the kind of sound that didn't just happen. Someone or something had to make it. I decided to distract myself by tackling the attic. The realtor had barely mentioned it, and I'd been avoiding it since I moved in. But now, curiosity was getting the better of me. If the footsteps were coming from anywhere, it had to be up there. The staircase to the attic was narrow and steep, tucked away behind a small, creaky door at the end of the upstairs hallway. As I climbed, the air grew colder, and the faint, sour smell that lingered throughout the house grew stronger. By the time I reached the top, I was holding my breath, trying not to gag. The attic was exactly what I expected, dim, dusty, and full of forgotten things. Old furniture draped in yellowed sheets, cardboard boxes sagging with age, and a few broken picture frames leaned against the walls. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its weak light barely cutting through the shadows. I took a cautious step forward, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The attic felt wrong, as if the air itself was heavier, pressing down on me. I forced myself to breathe, reminding myself that it was just an attic. There was nothing to be afraid of, and then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, almost hidden behind a stack of crates, was a trunk. It was old, much older than anything else in the house. The wood was dark and cracked, and the metal hinges were spotted with rust. Something about it sent a chill down my spine. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong here. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lid. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, to go back downstairs and pretend I hadn't seen it. But I couldn't. Something about the trunk drew me in, like it was waiting for me. The lid was heavy, but it opened with a groan that echoed through the attic. Inside, the contents were strange. Papers, old photographs, and a leather-bound journal. The photos were faded, black and white images of the house. In some, the yard was overgrown, much like it was now. But in others, the house looked pristine, almost new. I flipped through the photos, my fingers brushing against the brittle edges. There were people in some of them. A man in a long coat standing on the front porch, a woman staring out one of the upstairs windows. Their faces were blurred, the details lost to time, but their postures fell off. Stiff, unnatural. Setting the photos aside, I picked up the journal. The leather was cracked and worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. The handwriting inside was elegant but uneven, as if written in a rush. I scanned the first few entries, my heart racing as the words sank in. March 12, 1894. The house is ready. It has taken months to prepare, but I am finally ready to begin the work. The others think I am mad, but they do not understand. They cannot see the potential. This place is perfect, a nexus, a gateway. The energy here is strong, and I will harness it. March 20th, 1894. The rituals are more taxing than I anticipated. The air feels heavier with each passing day, but it is working. I can feel the power building, like a storm waiting to break. The others warned me not to proceed, but I have come too far to stop now. April 3rd, 1894. Something is wrong. The house is restless. I hear noises at night. Footsteps, whispers, things moving in the dark. I tell myself it is only my imagination, but I know better. I have opened the door, and something is coming through. I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. The air in the attic felt colder, the shadows darker. It was just a story, I told myself. Someone's imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps, the sounds, the way the house seemed alive, it was all connected. I shoved the journal and photos back into the trunk, slamming the lid shut. I couldn't stay up here any longer. As I turned to leave, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. But this time, they weren't distant or faint. They were right behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the attic was empty. The footsteps stopped, leaving only the sound of my own panicked breathing. I didn't wait to see if they would start again. I bolted down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind me. Back in the safety of the living room, I tried to calm myself. It was just an old house. I repeated over and over. Old houses made noises, but the memory of those footsteps wouldn't leave me. They had been so clear, so deliberate. I decided I needed answers. Mrs. Harris had mentioned the house's history, but she hadn't told me everything. The next morning, I planned to visit her and find out what she knew. But as I sat in the darkened living room, listening to the house creak and groan around me, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The next morning, I woke up to a quiet house. The kind of stillness that feels almost unnatural, like the world outside had forgotten to move. It was a feeling I had become all too familiar with over the past few days. The house had a way of pressing down on you, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. I didn't waste any time. After grabbing a quick breakfast, I set out to find Mrs. Harris. The sooner I found out what she knew about this place, the better. There was no point in denying it anymore. The strange noises, the footsteps, the journal. Something was wrong with this house. And if I didn't figure out what, I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay. Her house was a short walk down the street, tucked behind a neat hedge and flower beds that looked well cared for. I knocked on the door, and she answered within moments, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Good morning," she said cheerfully, stepping aside to let me in. "What brings you by today?" "I was just making some tea. I was hoping you could tell me a bit more about the history of the house I moved into," I said, trying to sound casual, but the words felt heavy in my mouth. "You mentioned some strange things before, and I've been hearing noises at night." She froze, her smile faltering for just a moment before she recovered. "Noises?" she repeated, her voice softened now, as if testing the air. "Well, I suppose I can tell you a bit more, but I'm not sure it'll help." We sat down at her small kitchen table, and she poured 2 cups of tea, her hands steady despite the tension in the air. I could feel her hesitance, like she wasn't sure whether she should share what she knew. "The house has always had a reputation," she began, her eyes flickering to the window as if making sure no one else was listening. "It's been here for over 100 years, and in that time, a lot of people have lived in it, but not many stay long." I leaned in, eager to hear more. "What do you mean? Why don't they stay?" Mrs. Harris set down her teacup with a small clink and sighed. "Well, there's talk. Rumors, really. The house was built by a man named Jacob Reed, a recluse. No one knew much about him, except that he kept to himself. People say he was obsessed with the occult. Rituals, summoning spirits, that sort of thing. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. What kind of rituals?" Her eyes darted to the window again. "I don't know the details, but I've heard stories. Strange things happening at night, lights flickering, things moving on their own. One of the previous tenants, a young woman, ran out of the house in the middle of the night, babbling about curses and demons. She was never the same after living there." I swallowed hard. "A curse?" Mrs. Harris nodded, her face serious now. That's what they say. The house, it's tied to something. Something old. People think it was something Jacob Reed did. Some kind of door he opened. Something he shouldn't have. I felt my stomach tighten. What happened to him? She looked away, almost like she was afraid to speak the words. No one really knows. He just disappeared. One day, he was there and the next gone. Some people say he was taken. Others think he went somewhere else. But the house remained. I couldn't process it all. A curse, rituals, demons. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but the way Mrs. Harris spoke, it was as if she truly believed it. And the noises I've been hearing, I said, my voice quieter now, they're connected to this curse? She nodded slowly. They could be... It's not unusual for the house to react to newcomers. It's almost like it's testing you. Some people hear things at night. Footsteps whispering, things moving. And then there are cold spots. But you have to be careful. The house doesn't like to be ignored. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. What do you mean, doesn't like to be ignored? Mrs. Harris hesitated before answering. I don't know for sure, but I've heard stories. People who stayed there long enough start to feel something, like it's watching them, waiting. Some leave, but others, well, they don't always leave. They start acting strange, like they become part of it. I stood up suddenly, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I think I've heard enough. I appreciate you telling me all this, Mrs. Harris. I need to go. Her face softened as I grabbed my coat. Be careful, dear. The house has a way of getting inside your head. If you feel something's wrong, don't stay. Trust your instincts. I nodded stiffly and left her house in a hurry, my mind racing. Her words echoed in my head. The house doesn't like to be ignored. I had to know more. I had to understand what was going on, even if it terrified me. That night, as the wind howled outside, I sat in the living room, the darkness creeping around the edges of the room. The house felt more oppressive than ever. The temperature had dropped, and I could see my breath as I exhaled. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see something standing in the doorway, just out of sight. I stood up and walked to the hallway, towards the stairs. My heart was pounding in my chest, the air thick with tension. I had to find out more about Jacob Reed, about the rituals, about whatever was haunting this house. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. There, at the end of the hallway, was a figure, a shadow, standing motionless in the dark. I blinked, and it was gone. My blood ran cold. I wasn't imagining it. Whatever was in this house was watching me. I spent the next few days in a daze, torn between fear and an overwhelming need to understand what was happening in that house. The figure in the hallway had been no illusion. I knew it. My mind wouldn't let me believe otherwise. And yet, I couldn't shake the thought that this was something I had to figure out, something I couldn't just run away from. I had come this far, hadn't I? And I needed answers. The house had a grip on me now, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I could feel its presence pressing down on me. Even when I wasn't hearing the footsteps or feeling the cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, I knew it was there, waiting, watching. I started spending my evenings in the attic, searching through the trunk I'd found, hoping to uncover something that would make sense of it all. I pulled out the journal again, flipping through its brittle pages. The more I read, the more the chilling details sank in. Jacob Reed's obsession with the occult, his strange rituals, the whispers about him opening a door to what? I had to know. But as I dug deeper, the house seemed to grow more restless. At night, the temperature would plummet, the walls groaning with the sound of shifting beams. It was as though the house itself was waking up, responding to my curiosity. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, felt like a warning. Then, one night, I found something. I was in the attic, going through the old papers, when I came across a letter. The handwriting was familiar, Jacob Reed's. The letter was dated a year before his disappearance, and it was addressed to someone named Edmund, someone I hadn't seen mentioned in the journal before. I read it aloud, my voice barely a whisper in the silent attic. January 18th, 1893. Edmund, the ritual is nearly complete. The door is almost open, and with it, power beyond imagination. I can feel it pressing against me, a presence that grows stronger with each passing night. The house is responding to my efforts, and soon we will have access to what lies beyond. I know the risks. I can hear them. The whispers in the walls, the footsteps that echo through the halls at night. But it is too late. The door has already been cracked, and there is no going back. You must join me if you wish to survive what comes next. I have seen things, Edmund, terrible things. I cannot describe them, for the words do not exist. But I know one thing for certain. Once the door is opened, there is no closing it. Prepare yourself. It is coming. We are on the brink of something unimaginable. Jacob Reed. The letter sent a shiver down my spine. A door. Something beyond. What had Jacob Reed unleashed on this house? And who was Edmund? I couldn't just let this rest. I had to know more. But as I stood there, staring at the letter, the house seemed to grow darker. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. Suddenly, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and slow. The same footsteps I had heard before. They echoed through the attic, just behind me. My heart thudded in my chest as I spun around, expecting to see someone or something there. But the attic was empty. I couldn't breathe. I felt dizzy, like the walls were closing in around me. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the presence of something unseen. My hands shook as I fumbled with the letter, stuffing it back into the trunk and slamming the lid shut. I had to get out of there. I stumbled down the stairs, my mind racing. The footsteps were still there, following me, growing louder, closer. I could almost feel the weight of them, like something was just behind me, waiting to catch up. I reached the bottom of the stairs and froze. There, standing in the hallway, was a shadow, a figure. It was tall, thin, and dark. No distinct features, just an outline that blended with the darkness. I couldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat like a drum, ringing in my ears. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. I gasped for air, my legs shaking, my hands clammy. I was terrified, but I couldn't leave. Not now. Not when I was so close to understanding what was happening here. I had to find Edmund. I had to find out who he was and what role he played in all of this. But when I went downstairs the next morning, the house felt different. There was a sense of stillness in the air, like something was waiting. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was off. I knew then that the house wasn't just haunted by the past. It was alive with the things Jacob Reed had brought into this world. And I was stuck here, caught between whatever force he had unleashed and the darkness that lingered within these walls. I had to leave, but the house wouldn't let me. The morning after the encounter in the hallway, I could hardly function. My mind was spinning, my thoughts fragmented. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was playing with me, pushing me to the brink of madness. The footsteps, the shadow in the hallway, the cold spots, it was all too much. But I couldn't leave. I knew that, deep down, there was something I had to understand. The house wasn't just haunted. It was tethered to something ancient, something terrible. I had to uncover every piece of its past, no matter how terrifying. I couldn't let Jacob Reed's unfinished business control me like it had so many others. I spent the next few days combing through the attic again, going over every piece of the journal and the letter, searching for any clue that could help me make sense of it all. The more I read, the more I felt like I was being drawn deeper into something I couldn't escape. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a living thing, breathing in the walls, feeding off the fear of anyone who dared to enter. I was starting to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. Every time I thought I understood what was happening, another strange occurrence would throw me off course. The house had its own rhythm, its own rules, and I was playing by them whether I liked it or not. It was late one evening when I finally found it, a reference to something called the veil. I had come across it in Jacob Reed's journal, buried deep within the pages of rambling notes and diagrams. The more I read, the more I realized that this veil wasn't just a metaphor. It was real, a barrier between this world and whatever lay beyond. Jacob had been trying to tear it down. The rituals he had performed, the strange symbols etched into the walls of the house. It was all part of his plan to open the veil. I sat there in the attic, the weight of the revelation pressing down on me. The door he had opened, the one that Edmund had been warned about, it wasn't just a door. It was a passage, a link between this world and something darker, something that should never be allowed to cross over. And whatever Jacob had unleashed was still here, waiting for its next victim. I couldn't just sit by and let whatever was trapped on the other side spill into the world. I had to find a way to stop it, but I had no idea how. I decided to go back to Mrs. Harris. She had to know more. I didn't want to, but I felt like I had no choice. She had been here longer than anyone, and she might have some answers I couldn't find on my own. When I knocked on her door that evening, she seemed surprised to see me. She was sitting by the window, knitting something absent-mindedly, her eyes distant. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice full of concern. "I need to ask you something," I said, stepping inside. "About Jacob Reed, the rituals he was doing, the veil. Do you know anything about it?" Mrs. Harris's face went pale. She set her knitting aside, her hands trembling. "You've been reading the journal, haven't you?" I nodded. "I don't understand. What is the veil? What did Jacob Reed do?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I had hoped you wouldn't find that part, but now that you have," she took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Jacob wasn't just trying to open the veil. He was trying to cross over to the other side." I stared at her, my pulse quickening. "What do you mean, cross over?" She paused, her gaze distant, as if she were remembering something long buried. "The veil separates our world from another, a dark world, a place where the things that shouldn't exist dwell. Jacob believed that if he could break through, he would gain unimaginable power. He thought he could control it, but..." She shook her head. "He underestimated it. He unleashed something terrible. And now, that thing is here. In this house." I could feel my stomach twist. "You mean something came through?" She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. "It's been waiting for someone like you, someone who would find the journal, someone who would uncover the truth. And now that you know, it won't let you go." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, choking the life out of the room. I had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, my voice cracking. She reached out, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "You have to leave. You have to get out of that house. The longer you stay, the stronger it gets." But as I pulled away, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, making the curtains flutter and the candles flicker. Mrs. Harris gasped, her eyes wide with fear. "It's already here." I turned to look behind me, but the room was empty. There was no one there, no shadow, no figure, just the unsettling quiet that seemed to surround us. "I can't leave," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm not safe anywhere. It won't stop until it has me." Mrs. Harris's expression softened with regret. "It's not too late. You can still get out. You can still escape." But I didn't believe her. I could feel it now, deep in my bones. The house wasn't just a place. It was a prison, and the thing that was haunting it, whatever it was never going to let me go. I left Mrs. Harris's house that evening, but the weight of her words lingered, pressing down on me with every step I took. The house, it was more than a house. It was a tomb, a prison, a doorway to something I couldn't comprehend. I tried to push everything she had told me out of my mind, but it wouldn't let me. The feeling of being watched, the cold drafts, the footsteps in the night. None of it felt like random occurrences anymore. It was all connected, all part of something bigger, something ancient. And now, I was trapped in its web. As I walked back to the house, I noticed the familiar creaks of the floorboards beneath my feet. They had become almost comforting, a reminder of the house's age, its history. But now, they felt more like the groans of a beast awakening from slumber. I made my way inside, determined to face whatever it was that lurked within these walls. I had to find a way to stop it. I had to understand what had happened, what Jacob Reed had done to this place. The house was eerily silent as I closed the door behind me, the air thick with tension. It felt like the calm before a storm, but I didn't know which direction the storm was coming from. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. Everything was just as it had been. The same dust motes floating in the air, the same shadows stretching across the walls. But something felt off. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I went into the living room and sat down, staring at the fireplace. The flames had long since gone out, and the room was bathed in an unsettling darkness. I could feel it then, more than ever before, the presence, the eyes that were watching me from every corner. I tried to shake it off, to calm myself, but the anxiety was too strong. I couldn't ignore the sounds anymore. The whispers in the walls, the scratching in the floors. It was all around me, coming from places I couldn't pinpoint. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to steady my nerves. I had to figure out how to stop this, how to close the door Jacob had opened. But how could I? The house was alive with the energy of whatever he had summoned. Every crack in the walls, every draft of cold air felt like a part of it, a reminder that I was no longer in control. Suddenly, I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from upstairs. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The house groaned again, but this time, the sound felt different. It wasn't the normal creaks of settling wood. It was deliberate, slow, measured. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by the door and started up the stairs. My heart raced with every step, my pulse thudding in my ears. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the attic. When I reached the top of the stairs, I paused, listening. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost unbearable. The tapping had stopped, but I could feel it just beneath the surface. The anticipation, the waiting. I pushed open the attic door. The room was dark, the only light coming from the weak beam of my flashlight. It flickered as I moved deeper into the room, casting strange shadows across the walls. The trunk was still there, its old, battered wood looking even more sinister in the half-light. I hesitated, then approached it. My hand trembled as I reached for the lid, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was wrong. I could feel it. The moment my fingers touched the wood, the tapping returned, louder now, more frantic. It was coming from inside the trunk. I pulled my hand back, gasping. The sound was maddening, a rhythmic scratching that sent shivers down my spine. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. The air around me seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners of the room shifting and twisting. It was as if the house itself was alive, its very walls pulsing with some dark energy. I had to open the trunk. I had to know what was inside, but I couldn't move. My body wouldn't obey. Then, a voice, a low, guttural whisper, breathed out from the darkness, so close to my ear that I could feel the air shift with its presence. Help me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, no one, just the oppressive silence of the attic, pressing in on me from all sides. I took a step back, my breathing shallow, my mind racing. I had to leave. I had to get out of this house before it consumed me, before whatever was waiting inside that trunk got its hands on me. But as I turned to run, the door slammed shut behind me. I turned back, heart racing, panic rising in my throat. The room was suffocating, the air thick with a pressure I couldn't escape. I pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I was trapped. The whispers came again, louder now, filling the room with their suffocating presence. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, tall, thin, with a dark cloak that seemed to swirl around it like smoke. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed on me. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the dark. I had to escape. I had to get out. I ran to the window, but the glass was fogged up as though the air itself had turned to ice. The figure moved closer, its presence growing stronger, pressing in on me from all sides. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The whispers stopped. The room fell silent. I stood there, trembling, drenched in cold sweat, trying to catch my breath. Had it been real, or had I imagined it? My mind was playing tricks on me. I knew it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, something terrible, something waiting. And I knew then that it was only a matter of time before it came for me. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. The walls seemed to close in on me. The air grew thicker, and every corner was filled with dread. The strange occurrences had escalated so quickly, and now, the house didn't feel like a place to live. It felt like a tomb, a place where the past refused to stay buried. But I was trapped. There was no escaping. Not until I understood what was happening. I had to know what Jacob Reed had done, what curse he had unleashed. Every night, the house seemed to whisper his name, and every day, I could feel its presence growing stronger. I paced the house, unsure of where to turn. It felt like I had already been through every room, every hallway 100 times, and yet there was still one place I hadn't dared to go, the basement. I had heard the rumors, of course. The neighbors had warned me about the house, about how the Reed family had left in a hurry, leaving everything behind, as if something terrible had driven them away. They'd said the basement had always been the most unsettling part of the house, a place nobody dared to go, even when the house had been sold to different owners over the years. But I couldn't avoid it any longer. I had to go down there. It was the last place that held any answers. That evening, after I had gathered enough courage, I found myself standing in front of the basement door. It was old, its wood weathered and cracked, as if it had not been opened in decades. The handle was cold to the touch, the metal rusted, but it turned easily, almost too easily, as if the house was eager to let me in. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The air down there was thick, musty, and still. There were no sounds at all, not even the familiar creaks of the house settling. It was as though the basement had been frozen in time, holding its breath, waiting for me to discover its secrets. I turned on the light, but the bulb flickered and buzzed before casting a dim glow across the room. The basement was small, cramped, filled with old furniture covered in dusty sheets. But it wasn't the furniture that made my heart race. It was the far corner, where the shadows seemed darker than they should be. Something was there. I could feel it. I stepped closer, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that covered the floor. I was drawn to the corner, as if someone was calling me, urging me to come closer. And then I saw it, a small wooden chest, pushed against the wall, partially hidden by old boxes and crates. It was old, the wood darkened with age, but what made it truly unnerving was the strange symbol carved into its surface. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before, a twisted, jagged pattern that seemed to move when I looked at it too long. I approached it cautiously, my breath shallow. It was the same symbol I had seen in the journal, the same one that had been linked to Jacob Reed's rituals. This was it. This was what he had used to open the door. I reached out, my hand trembling and touched the chest. The moment my fingers brushed against it, I felt a sharp, sudden cold, like a jolt of electricity running through me. It was as if the chest was alive, pulsing with energy. I pulled my hand back, but the feeling lingered, as though something had marked me, claimed me. The air in the basement grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift again. I felt something watching me, but this time, it wasn't just a presence. It was physical. It was as if something had stepped into the room with me, something I couldn't see but could feel, its breath on the back of my neck. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The basement was empty, just as it had been when I first stepped inside. But the silence was gone. The whispers had returned. They started softly, at first, murmurs that seemed to come from all directions, from the very walls themselves. Then, as the minutes passed, they grew louder, more frantic, as if they were closing in on me, suffocating me. I could hear my name, whispered over and over again, but it wasn't my voice. It was something else, something older, something that had been waiting in this house for far too long. I backed away from the chest, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers became a chant, growing in intensity, and then, just as I was about to turn and run, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, panic rising in my throat. The room was darker now, the shadows creeping closer. The temperature had dropped to freezing, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. I didn't know how much time passed, minutes, hours, I couldn't tell. But I couldn't move. I was trapped, and then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from above me, slow, methodical, as if someone or something was pacing just above the basement, its every step shaking the floor. I froze, my blood running cold. Whoever, or whatever, was up there, it was coming for me. I had to get out. The door creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, shrouded in darkness. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its presence, its eyes fixed on me, cold and unblinking. The footsteps above stopped, and the house fell silent again. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My body was paralyzed, my heart racing. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, it spoke. "Help me." The voice was familiar. It was the same voice I had heard in the attic, the same voice that had whispered to me in the darkness. "Help me, and you will never leave." The air around me grew colder still, and the shadows seemed to press in from all sides. The door slammed shut again, and I was left in complete darkness. The darkness pressed in around me, suffocating and absolute. My heart raced, a constant thumping in my chest, and I couldn't tell if I was breathing or holding my breath. The air was so thick now that it felt like I was suffocating. I could still feel the chill on the back of my neck, the weight of the presence that had been in the doorway. But now, it was gone. I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind raced, spinning in a loop. What had just happened? Who had spoken to me in that voice? And why had I heard it again? The footsteps above me resumed, but they were different now. They weren't slow and deliberate anymore. They were frantic, erratic, as if something was pacing, unable to settle. The noise reverberated through the floor, a thudding sound that made the walls tremble, like the house itself was shaking from the inside. I slowly reached for the flashlight in my pocket, my hand trembling. When I switched it on, the weak beam barely cut through the dark. I pointed it around the basement, but nothing but shadows and old furniture. I felt ridiculous. Of course there was nothing there. I was just imagining things, right? But the whispers didn't stop. They were louder now, and they weren't just whispers anymore. They had turned into voices. Too many voices, all speaking at once. They echoed around me, growing more desperate. Some were soft, pleading, while others were sharp, angry. Some cried for help, while others shouted threats. And then, underneath it all, the same voice I had heard before, "Help me, help me, help." I took a shaky breath, and forced myself to move. I needed to get out of here. There was no reasoning with whatever this was. No solving it. It was too much, too old, too deep for me to understand. I couldn't stay here anymore. I needed to leave, but the fear gripped me, paralyzing me in place. I turned toward the stairs, my mind racing through every possible way to escape, but the air seemed to thicken, as if the very house was holding me prisoner. My feet felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor with every step. It took all of my willpower just to move. Every creak of the old wooden stairs under my feet sent a jolt of panic through me. But I had to leave. I had to get out before it was too late. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A door slammed shut somewhere in the house. My heart stopped, and I froze in place. I wasn't the only one here. Something was moving through the house. Something was awake. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the panic threatening to choke me. I had to move quickly. My hand shot out to grab the banister, but I stopped just short when I felt something brush against my arm. I whirled around, flashlight in hand, ready to face whatever had touched me. Nothing. There was nothing there. But the temperature in the hallway had dropped. I could see my breath, thick and white in the air. A cold, damp feeling crawled over my skin, making every hair on my body stand on end. And the whispers, God, the whispers, they were louder now. They were close. I could hear them all around me, as if something was standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. They grew louder, then softer, only to grow louder again, like the walls themselves were speaking. A jumble of voices and laughter and crying. I didn't dare turn around. I knew that whatever was behind me, I didn't want to see it. I needed to get out. I needed to leave. I hurried to the front door, my fingers fumbling with the doorknob. It was locked. Of course, it was locked. How could I have been so stupid? I had to force myself to remain calm, to think clearly. There had to be another way out. I turned and made my way to the back door, hoping to find some escape. But just as I reached for the handle, the house groaned. It was a deep, low groan, the kind you might expect from a living creature, not an inanimate building. It rattled the windows and made the walls vibrate. I froze. The door behind me swung open on its own. It wasn't a draft. No, this was something far worse. And standing in the doorway, just outside, was the figure again. The same figure that had spoken to me in the basement. It didn't move at first. It simply stood there, watching me. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of its form, but I felt its eyes on me. I felt them burning into me. The whispers stopped, and then it spoke again. You can't leave. The voice was colder than the air itself, and as it spoke, I felt the temperature drop even further, as if the very air around me was being sucked out of the room. I couldn't breathe. The figure didn't move, but I could feel something else now. Something deeper. Something darker. The door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the faintest sound of a laugh. Not a human laugh. Something else. Something ancient. Something evil. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just had to get away. Had to find a way out before it was too late. But there was no way out. Not anymore. The house had claimed me. The house was alive. I knew it now. Every creak, every whisper, every fleeting shadow was part of it, a pulsating, malevolent entity. It didn't want me to leave, and I wasn't sure I could anymore. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the journal like a lifeline. My breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of what I had uncovered crushing my chest. The journal, its words now burned into my mind, revealed the full extent of the horror. The house's original owner, a man named Elias Harker, had been consumed by his obsession with the occult. He had performed rituals in the basement, seeking immortality, seeking power. But the cost of his desires had been catastrophic. He had succeeded in binding his spirit to the house, but in doing so, he had unleashed something else, something ancient and hungry. And now, it had me. The words of the last entry haunted me. Asterisk, the house is a vessel. It breathes. It consumes. There is no escape, no end. It will claim them all, as it claimed me. Asterisk, I should have left the house the moment I stepped inside. I should have heeded the neighbors' warnings, the stories about the previous tenants fleeing in terror. But it was too late now. I was trapped. That night, the house truly came alive. It began with the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, ascending the stairs toward my bedroom. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. I clutched the journal tighter, as if it could protect me, though I knew it was useless. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the doorknob began to turn, slowly, agonizingly. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The door creaked open, and the air in the room grew icy. A shadow stretched across the floor, long and distorted, as if the thing casting it was not of this world. Then I saw it. Elias Harker, or what was left of him. His form was barely human, a twisted amalgamation of flesh and shadow. His eyes were hollow, pits of endless darkness, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. He didn't walk. He glided toward me, the air around him crackling with unnatural energy. "You should not have come here," his voice rasped, a guttural growl that echoed in my skull. "You've read my words. You've opened the door. I didn't mean to." I stammered, backing against the wall. "I didn't know." "You belong to the house now," he said, his voice thick with malice. "You cannot leave. It will not let you." I felt the walls close in around me, the room shrinking, the air suffocating. The shadows writhed, reaching for me, pulling me into their cold embrace. Panic surged through me, and I fought against the invisible force, clawing at the walls, screaming for help. But no one could hear me. With a burst of desperation, I grabbed the journal and hurled it at him. It struck his chest, and for a brief moment he faltered. The shadows recoiled, and I seized the opportunity. I bolted from the room, my feet pounding against the creaking floorboards as I fled down the stairs. The house fought back. The walls groaned, the floor buckled, and the shadows chased me, whispering my name in 1,000 distorted voices. I reached the front door and yanked it open, the cold night air hitting me like a wave. I didn't stop to look back. I ran into the darkness, leaving everything behind. My belongings, the journal, the cursed house. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. As I drove away, the house loomed in the rearview mirror, its dark windows like empty eyes watching me go. I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway, but I didn't dare look too long. I drove through the night, my mind racing, my heart pounding. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was dread. The house had let me go, but I knew it wasn't over. The mark it left on me was permanent, a stain I could never erase. Even now, as I sit in a cheap motel miles away, I can feel it, the presence, the weight, the whispers and the shadows. The house may be miles behind me, but it still has its grip on me, and I know deep down that I'll never truly escape. It's only a matter of time before it finds me again. And when it does, I won't get away.